Flirtation. Shifters Forever Worlds. By L. Thorne. Chapter 1. Outside the building where she and many children had been held, Dakotah cowered in the bushes, watching men morph into animals, their faces widening, their bones lengthening, fur covering their body. With the horrifying sounds of bone crunching and tearing flesh, these men became bears, polar bears, and possibly some grizzly bears, though she was no expert on types of bears. There was a tiger and a lion in the group. These fierce creatures battled, fangs exposed, claws flying, blood spewing. Some of them she recognized. They had been her captors, her tormentors. Others were the enemies of her captors, battling them, drawing blood and taking lives. But did that make the enemies of her enemies, her friends? She doubted it. She had not fared well during the time she was held captive by shapeshifters. Dakotah watched the fight, wide-eyed, chewing on her bottom lip, praying she could get away during the scuffle without getting caught. When the melee was well underway, and the bad guys, aka her captors, were not winning, she decided to take her chance to flee. Though she was not sure the ones who were winning were good guys. Without rising, scurrying away while crouching low, she slipped through the bushes, making her way through the thick underbrush. Dakotah had escaped her imprisoners before, climbing the fence and disappearing into the forest. There was nowhere for her to go for miles. Her tormentors found her every time. She'd heard them boasting about how they had tracked her, how they had followed her scent, how they could hear her heartbeat with their super-sensitive hearing. With one backward glance at the fur flying and blood flowing, she left, running swiftly as a woman carrying a baby in her body could. She entered a clearing where the forest ended for a brief spell, and found herself faced with several vehicles, most SUVs. None were the ones of her captors. She'd known that immediately. A light bulb went off in her mind. Cannot find what you cannot smell, she thought derisively. She tested one of the vehicles, pulling on the door handles. No luck. Locked. She tried another. The same, also locked. She gritted her teeth. Tears of frustration welled. She swiped them away. No patience or time for self-pity or self-defeat. She'd find a way. For her baby and herself. The fourth vehicle finally yielded, the back hatch opening. Dakotah raised her eyes to the sky. "Thank you," she whispered. She climbed into the vehicle, and huddled into a ball, holding her legs tightly to her body, resting her chin on her knees, ignoring the swell of her belly, hidden beneath her curves that protested the extra pressure. Now if she could only make it out of the area, without being caught. Dakotah startled. The feel of the car moving woke her. She was getting ready to raise her head to figure out where she was, when her memories returned. She'd escaped during the fight. And now? Who was driving the car? She felt a half measure of relief that it wouldn't be one of the tormentors she was escaping. That was not where they parked their cars. This vehicle belonged to a visitor. Soft music came on the speaker next to Dakotah's ear. She flinched at the unexpected sound. Every sense in her body was on high alert. The vibration made by the music on the plastic siding against her back felt like the tremor of an earthquake. The sound of the music seemed as loud as a tornado, though she knew it was not so. And so the drive was uneventful, filled with this lulling music that would normally have put her to sleep, but there was no sleep for Dakotah now. She was fully awake. Was it possible? She was free? Free at last. Free of those. She'd never thought that sort of thing existed. People who shifted into animals. That was in fairy tales and horror movies. Well, she was living a horror movie still. A fluttering in her stomach reminded her how much she lived in a nightmare. And yet thinking that thought made her feel like a traitor. Her baby wasn't a monster. Even if it was half one of those things. A tear trickled down her cheek. She'd never imagined it would be this way. Those shape-shifting beings had. She clenched her fists, the fury of it was too much. The things they had done to her, the tests, the fertilization. They hadn't even knocked her out with general anesthesia. She'd been awake, strapped down while they impregnated her with. Dakotah's jaw seized, the muscles tight. Now, months later, here she was, carrying one of those things. Carrying? She shook her head to push the thoughts away, but they would not go. She had one of those in her now. Again, she chastised herself for her traitorous thoughts. The baby was half her and half shapeshifter. She thought of the children that had been trapped in that compound with her. All the little children in that barbed wire hell, held in cages, tested and checked as if they were cattle before a sale. Dakotah had held the children, held them though they were miniature versions of the larger shapeshifters that kept her captive. Each and every one of them she'd loved. Younger ones and older ones while they cried about missing their mothers or wanting their families. Some of them didn't even remember their families, they'd been in orphanages for a long time. They had cried and they had become angry and frustrated, and with every emotion their shifter animal had become dominant and taken over their bodies, making these tiny little creatures shift into cubs of all varieties. Little panthers and tigers, snarling and hissing at each other and their captors. Dakotah was the only one they had not hissed at. She'd practically become a foster mother to them. Inasmuch as Dakotah hated the adult shapeshifters, her heart went out to the babies and the children. She hoped she could find the same kind of sympathy for the one within her. She hoped the hatred she felt for her captors would not affect her emotions for this little baby that kicked and fluttered in her abdomen. And then the horror hit her. What was she supposed to do with a little newborn shapeshifter baby? What was she supposed to do? If she escaped? If she lived long enough? If giving birth didn't kill her? Dakotah slammed her knuckles and her mouth to keep the cry that wanted to escape from coming out, and settled back against the vehicle's side. For now she had a greater problem, making sure she didn't get caught. Her stomach rumbled. And maybe getting something to eat.
Chapter 2. Braden Cartwright stepped off Mikhail Romanov's jet. He shook the pilot's hand. "Thanks for the lift." The pilot shook his head, waved off the handshake, and gave Braden a small salute. "It was good to see you again, Sergeant." Braden acknowledged his salute, wondering if there would ever come a day when he was not reminded of the life he had spent so many years living. Too many years. Too many secrets. The memories tormented his nights. How could he tell them not to call him Sergeant? How could he tell anyone that he would rather forget those days? He concentrated hard to keep from flinching. Every single time those days came to mind, the scars burned anew, as if someone was again pressing that hot metal to his flesh. Pushing that thought away only brought other images forward. The images of holding his weapon, its barrel trained on a civilian, his heart breaking as he had to make the most difficult decision, and never liking the decision he had to make, and never sitting easy with the choice he selected. But in the end, he had to choose his country. He had to choose his squad. Even if the target in his sight was a woman or a child that was not so innocent, armed and ready to kill at the request of evil men who would sacrifice a child for selfish means. When his nephew Bain, closer in age to being a brother, suggested that Braden might enjoy a few days away in Bear Canyon Valley, he knew the invitation was heaven sent. And here he was. He took a deep breath of the clean, crisp air. So very different from the scorching air in the Middle East and the smoggy air of New York City. He let the air out and surveyed his surroundings, taking in the tall mountains, formidable and green with white tip caps. The lushness of the valley. You didn't have to. Braden shoved his bag in the back of Bain's vehicle. "We could have just gone to your place, ordered pizza, chilled. There is no need for a big production." Bain had just told him they'd be hanging out with friends at a barbecue and celebration. "You don't understand," Bain said. "Bear Canyon Valley residents don't operate that way. I'm family now. You'll be family too before you leave. It's just how they roll. Plus, they're celebrating taking down some bad dudes kidnapping shifter kids." Braden gave his nephew a look. "Long story," Bain said. "But back to Bear Canyon Valley. They're like family. Like I said, you'll see soon enough. Braden had never really been part of a family. He would try to keep an open mind, though, for Bain's sake. Especially considering what Bain had been through. Which brought his next question to mind. How are Karina and her daughter? You'd have never known Bree had been through all she has. She's bonded with her mom. She calls me Daddy. A red bloom of happiness flushed Bain's cheeks. You look happy. Happier than he'd ever seen his nephew. Enviably happy. It's just the beginning for me. I feel like I've been waiting for this all my life. Like I didn't live until Karina and little Bree entered my life. Braden was glad his nephew had found joy. He knew it wasn't something he was destined for. He'd be lucky if he ever found peace, never mind happiness. 15 minutes later, Bain pulled into a driveway where several cars were parked in front of a brick and wood two-story. Next to it was a building that looked like a second home, or a mother-in-law addition. Braden pointed toward the building and looked to Bain for an answer. That one's Doc's house. Beside it is his clinic. Best damn shifter doctor ever. May is his mate. She's an elemental. Don't freak out when you see her eyes changing color, or she gets pissed off and you hear the roll of thunder in the distance. Braden wasn't completely unfamiliar with elementals. There'd been a couple associated with his unit in the Middle East. In fact, he'd heard they were instrumental in getting him released when he was a POW. You've gotten close to all these people, he remarked. Bain gave him his half-smile. You'll understand one day. He got out of the vehicle. If you stick around long enough. Braden wasn't one to stick around. He spent most of his time moving from place to place, looking for the one spot where the torment would not find him every night. We'll see, he told his nephew. Bain pointed to the porch, where a dark-haired woman and her mirror image in a smaller package rose from rocking chairs and hastened toward them. Karina and Bree. The love was evident in his voice. The two females ran to Bain, wrapped their arms around him. My Uncle Braden. He introduced them. Karina and Brianna. We call her Bree. After a quick round of hugs, Bain suggested they go inside. The door opened before they could even get on the porch. One by one a stream of people poured out, happy smiling faces. It seemed behind every curvy woman walked a large shifter, and it was very clear and easy to read their couple bond mark. All of the women and the men bore the sign that signified their forever bond with their mate. It was like an invisible thread, but one shifters could see. A self-assured, confident brunette stepped forward. Braden. She wrapped him in a hug. I'm May. I hope you can stay for a while. Good luck with that. But of course, he wouldn't say that out loud. Thank you. Behind her, a dark-haired man said, Yes, you have to stay for a while. We like having guests, he said with a glance at Bain. We like it even better when the guests decide to stay and become one of us. I'm Doc. Nice to meet you. Braden took his hand. May pointed to a foursome. That's Kelsey. And there's Teague. Her fingers ticked them off. And next to them, Tanner and Marty. Braden studied the woman. I thought I recognized you. I was sitting in the back of the courtroom when Tanner Navarro was on trial, he said. I remember seeing you, Marty responded with a smile. I'm glad those days are past. Me too, Tanner said. A little boy stood next to them, a quiet expression on his face. His eyes traveled between Bain and Braden. Braden lowered himself to the youngin's height, looked the little boy in his eye. You're Dominic, right? Bain is your uncle, isn't he? He asked him. The little boy nodded. Braden pointed to his own chest. I'm Bain's uncle. Really? Dominic's eyes went wide. Really, Dominic? Bain picked him up, tousled his hair. Then passed him off to Braden. Braden hesitated. Just a moment. He'd never been around kids. Then he opened his arms, while at the same time his heartstrings were plucked. This little boy was his family. Bain and Dominic were the closest thing he had to blood. Hey, let's play. Another little boy came running forward from the front door. Let's play shifter football. Come on, Dominic. A man and a woman followed the little boy out the front door. And this is Joe and Sarah. May pointed to the adults. And that's Ivan. She indicated the little boy. Ivan was jumping up and down. Let's play shifter football. Come on, everybody. Sarah shook her head at her son. It's nice to meet you, she said to Braden. Yeah, Ivan said. Do you want to play with us, Braden? It's guys only, except for my mom. He pointed to Sarah. She's a shifter. And she kicks apples. Joe stepped forward with a laugh. Your mom kicks apples, son. Nice save, Joe. Doc laughed. I better get around the back. No telling if something on the grill is burning. Ivan's doing well, isn't he? Kelsey noted. All things considered. Braden didn't have to wonder what those things were, because Joe went straight into an explanation. Considering he lived as a bear for the first few years of his life, without talking or shifting into his human, I'd say he's doing really well, Joe beamed. And he calls Joe Daddy now. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. Joe put his arm around her. You're both in a better place. His eyes met with Doc's. But it's not over yet. Braden was starting to think this friendly little valley wasn't as simplistic as it seemed at first glance. He looked at Bain for an explanation. Joe stepped in quickly. Sarah was held in an institution. We're looking into it. Braden nodded and studied the female grizzly shifter in Joe's arms. Braden knew all about being held against one's will. It sucked. Here comes Griz. Joe tipped his head toward the driveway. An old truck pulled up, more rust bucket colored than red, and out stepped one of the largest men Braden had ever seen. And he was no small man himself. Not by a long shot. A scar crossed his face, starting above his eyebrow, extending down over his cheekbone, almost to his jawline. Braden had seen his share of scars. He'd be willing to put money this came from something not unlike a bear claw. Could have been a blade, but he would have bet it had been on the end of a paw. Sorry I'm late, had to stop in town. Griz put his fingertips to his brow as though making a salute, and held up his other arm, a large cake in hand. By the way, Sierra called, changed her mind, said she was coming after all. I was going to wait for her until she called to say she was running a little behind. A look of concern crossed May's face. Is she okay? Griz frowned. She didn't say she wasn't. I asked, but she said everything was fine. He tipped his head back, nose to the air, nostrils flaring. Something burning. Crap. Doc pulled a 180 and took long strides toward the back. Braden couldn't take another bite, he was stuffed. These Bear Canyon Valley people knew how to barbecue. It had been quite a spread. He leaned back in the Adirondack chair and watched Dominic and Ivan carouse in the grass. Joe joined them, taking turns hoisting one boy in the air, then the other. So Braden, what do you do? Here we go, here comes the real grilling. I freelance. He wasn't ready to discuss his career choices after his time in the Middle East. Braden was in the military, Bain volunteered. A look passed between Doc and May, one Braden didn't understand since he didn't know them. Thank you for your service. May finally filled the silence. Joe was in the military for a while. Her gaze was focused on the man sitting in the grass, playing with the two young shifters. He doesn't talk about it much. We respect his right to privacy. Braden nodded, appreciating that she was letting him know they would not pry. He got lucky anyway, because a woman came around the corner of the house, long white hair flowing, eyes that were lighter colored than Bain's, with grungy marks on her dress, as if she'd been in a scuffle. Sorry I'm late. She was out of breath. Griz rose from his spot, his gaze traveling up and down her. What happened to you? I fell. I'm fine. That's it. Griz frowned, the scar making his face look formidable in a fearsome way. She wasn't telling the truth, that was easy enough for Braden to see. He studied her, finding something different about this woman, something ethereal, and at the same time something eerie. When she glanced his way, he felt a flashback, and the scars on his body began to burn. Those eyes. He closed his own to block out something, though he couldn't have said what. He racked his brain to remember, but at the same time, he wanted to push back the unpleasantness. Griz cleared his throat, jarring Braden from his contemplations. "So what made you late?" he asked Sierra. She paused. A gamut of emotions traveled over her face. Braden wondered if she was going to tell the truth about this. "I had a stowaway." She glanced away, her eyelids lowered as if sealing herself away. Griz crossed his arms over his chest. "Details, please." "I don't know when she got in the car, but I felt a presence, so I got out to check. I opened the door, she knocked me down, then ran off. It wasn't too far from here, and I was worried about her, so I tried to look for her. No luck." "That's it. You're very late for something that is spoken of so briefly." "I knew she was there. I was almost home, that's when I turned around and started here. I've been driving for hours, waiting to see if she'd speak to me. I thought I'd be able to reach out to her, use my skills to get her to open up." She wheezed out a breath. "I'm not making sense." Griz looked at Doc. "I wonder if that was the woman Lance saw. She was a prisoner at the compound. Banged up. Scratched up. This woman definitely looked like she'd been through something," Sierra said. "We'll check into it." Griz frowned. "Hopefully, she's not going to pose any dangers to the community." "She didn't look like she could harm a fly," Sierra said. "If so, then you wouldn't look like you'd been knocked to the ground," Griz countered. Sierra shook her head. "I still think she's going to need help." "That's your intuitive skills talking." Griz handed her a plate. "There's plenty of food. I need to use the facilities first." Sierra strode toward the back door. Joe approached Braden. "Where are you staying tonight?" "Hadn't really thought of that. Figured I'd stay at the local hotel." Bain clicked his tongue in disappointment. "No way, man. You're staying with us." "Yes, you must," Karina agreed. "Well," Joe said, "I was thinking he could have my cabin while he's in town. It's nice and isolated, private, quiet. Plus, you'll get to experience mountain living. Bain and Karina and Bree are staying at May's bed and breakfast. He can borrow one of my trucks." This came from Teague. "I've got a new company truck. Business is pretty good." "Must be," Doc laughed. "Construction's booming in the valley." Teague laughed. "It's keeping me busy. New homes, adding nurseries, ramping up security measures." He gave Braden a look over with an appraising eye. "In fact, if you find yourself looking for work, I'm hiring." "He pays well too," Tanner said with a laugh. "I ought to know." "You guys are too kind." Braden was getting a feeling for why Bain wanted to live here.
Chapter 3. On and on the car traveled, and with every minute, every mile, Dakotah said a little prayer of thanks. The farther the car traveled, the farther away from her abductors she would be. She thought of her roommate, and wondered if she was worried about her. She'd been gone so long now, she probably thought she was dead. She wondered if she ever filed a missing person report when she didn't return. When they took Dakotah, her captors thought she was homeless because she was coming out of the homeless center where she volunteered. After she was blindfolded and placed in the back of their van, she heard them talking about how no one would be looking for her if she was homeless. She could understand how they thought that, considering the fact she dressed in faded jeans with holes and a ratty t-shirt. She'd been out the night before, was pretty sure her mascara was streaked, and her hair was definitely in a messy bun that day. Though she wasn't homeless, she knew they were right about one thing: she doubted anyone would look for her. The SUV was slowing. This caught Dakotah's attention. She stiffened, wondering where they were, but she didn't want to risk it by poking her head up. There was only one person in the car, the driver. That much Dakotah knew. Only one car door had slammed earlier. There had not been any conversation, except for a couple on a cell phone, though Dakotah couldn't hear what was said. All she could determine was that it was female. The SUV came to a stop. The engine turned off, the door opened and then closed. Maybe the driver is home. Or going to get some food. Perhaps the driver is getting gas. Dakotah braced herself, not sure if the person would look in the back. She was relieved it wasn't one of those big shape-shifting guys. She'd noticed two women with them, and wondered if she could possibly get lucky enough that one of them would be driving the car. She listened but heard no footsteps. Heard nothing. The sound of fumbling with the door's latch made her blood run cold. Dakotah flinched. The hatch made a slow, arduous journey rising. Every second it took made the fear ratchet up in Dakotah's heart. She held her breath, poised to do something. Anything. When the hatch was fully up, a woman stood before her, one of the women who had been at the compound with the men who fought her captors. The woman looked at her. She had the palest eyes and hair so light it was almost white. She was in a long dress. Who? Get away from me! Dakotah screamed. But, with as much grace as she could manage, Dakotah jerked herself out of the car and shoved at the woman. The woman fell back, her long dress tangling in her feet. She landed hard against a tree. Let me help you. She rose to her feet. I can. No. And with that, Dakotah fled from the woman as fast as she could. When she glanced back, she noticed the woman was not following her, but stood outside the vehicle, holding a cell phone. Dakotah cursed herself for not tying up the woman or taking her phone away. Now she would send those men out to retrieve her. Fueled by that thought, she picked up speed. Either way you look at it, I'm screwed. So very screwed. Dakotah ran, until she couldn't run anymore, holding on to the swell of her belly, feeling the little one inside kicking and fussing, probably about being jostled. And still, the woman never followed. For sure sending those guys after me. Dakotah cursed her luck as she ran between the thick bushes, pausing to lean against a pine tree, the bark cutting into her flesh. Her chest heaved with the effort, her lungs were on fire. Not sure she could afford to pause for long, she began to walk again until she ran into a path that didn't seem to be used much. It's better than trying to make my way through all that undergrowth. She looked at the scratches on her arms. Judging from those, it was much better than trying to go through the undergrowth. The path led her down into a gully, and then up the side of the mountain, winding its way so the walk was not too steep. She almost cried out with joy and then fear when she saw a cabin. Dakotah slipped behind a tree and studied the cabin. The driveway, made of pebbled stones, was empty. Not a large cabin, it seemed well maintained if not exactly in use. The areas that had paint were not too chipped or peeling, and the roof was intact. She surveilled the cabin, watching the door diligently, waiting for someone to come out. After what seemed like an eternity, no one had. Thirst burned her throat. She had to make a choice not hard to make when hungry, thirsty, exhausted, pregnant, and scared. She tiptoed toward the cabin, approaching from a windowless corner where she would hopefully not be seen. As soon as she reached the cabin's outer walls, she sidled her way toward the front door, crouching as she passed windows. Before she touched the handle, she listened intently, but found no sounds coming from inside. Might as well. Turning the handle very slowly, she froze when the door squeaked. Damn it. She paused. Again she waited, but no one came out. With the door fully open, Dakotah studied the interior. Definitely did not have a woman's touch. Maybe a hunter's cabin. That would be perfect, as hunting season wouldn't be back around for another few months. Dakotah's stomach grumbled. I know. She spotted the pantry, in the corner of the kitchen of the one-room cabin. Rummaging through it, she found spaghetti and a jar of sauce. This will do. Tummy full, Dakotah looked around the cabin, feeling like an interloper not wanting to touch anything or infringe on anyone's privacy. A hunting rifle, one she was familiar with, lay on a gun rack. It had been a long time, and it brought back painful memories, but she had shot one before. Her father taught her, before he, her mother and brother had all been killed in a tragic plane crash. Dakotah had been a junior in high school. She stayed home, as she had a debate competition that weekend. For Dakotah, that event was the incident that downhill spiraled the rest of her life. She took the rifle off the rack and made herself comfortable on the sofa. She lay the weapon next to her, finger at the ready.
Chapter 4. Braden pulled the truck into the parking spot in front of the cabin. He set aside the directions Joe had given him and surveyed the little place. It looked in good shape, even though Joe said he and Sarah no longer lived there. It was dark outside, and the porch light wasn't on. Not that it mattered to a shifter. Shifter sight allowed him to see clearly, no matter how much light. He stifled a yawn. He hadn't planned on staying that late. After grabbing his bag from the passenger seat, he made his way to the front door and tried the handle. Odd, Joe said it wasn't locked. Maybe he forgot he locked it. Braden fished out of his pocket the just-in-case key Joe had given him and slipped it in, turning it. He glanced to the left and felt along the wall, looking for the light switch, even though he didn't need it. It just seemed weird to be walking around the dark. A sound made him freeze. It sounded like a moan. Standing still as a statue, Braden used his shifter hearing to listen for anything that seemed out of place. Breathing. Heartbeats. A soft sigh. Yes, these were sounds that definitely did not belong here. The sofa was turned away, so he couldn't see if anyone was on it. Angles of the cabin kept some of the corners from his line of sight. He scanned the wall for the light switch and flicked it on, then took a step to the left. Here was certainly something he did not expect. A woman lying on the couch, fast asleep. He studied her, taking in the curve of her cheek, the dark hair that flowed and haloed around her. Yes, she was attractive, that was undeniable. But who the hell is she? He took a step toward the couch, his hand outstretched, thinking he would wake her and perhaps ask her what she was doing here. He was confident he had followed the directions correctly and the key worked, so he knew he was in the right place. Maybe Sarah had told one of her friends she could stay here. That was when he noticed the rifle, but that didn't alarm him, as he meant her no harm. He took a step closer. Don't move. Her voice was resolute. Her eyes were wide open. They definitely held a warning. Her finger on the trigger quivered. She'd raised the weapon, and it was leveled right at his chest. I think. He took another step closer, hoping she would see that he was not a threat. Could you? I said don't move. Light brown eyes and a mocha face glared at him. One more step. But look, ID. The shot interrupted him.
Chapter 5. Dakotah jumped up, staring at the cabin's owner. The man was lying on the floor, unmoving. She didn't mean it. Damn him. She hadn't wanted to shoot him. She jerked, and that little bit of pressure. She wanted to be mad at him. She wanted it to be his fault. She told him not to move. She told him not to. Look at him now. Oh God. Blood blossomed on his chest, creating a horrifying pattern. She was torn between running, getting a towel, or calling 911. Did she hit his shoulder? Or something vital? She approached him, hoping he wasn't armed, hoping he didn't shoot her. She leaned down, kneeling next to him, not knowing what to do to help him. I'm sorry, she said. I wasn't going to hurt you. And then he closed his eyes. That's when panic hit. Now what? She had to call 911. How? There was no phone in the stupid cabin, at least not that she saw when she scrounged around the place earlier. Should she check him to see if he had a phone on him? That was the only choice. Though she didn't want to touch him, didn't want to hurt him further, and certainly didn't want to prod through his personal effects. But there was no choice. She had to get him help, and if he had a cell phone on him, that was their only chance. Unless he drove here in a car. She could get him to. Yeah, right, as if she could pick up this guy who was as wide as the door with broad shoulders and a thick chest. No choice, she had to find out if he had a phone. She reached for his pocket. A loud crack filled the cabin. Dakotah fell back. No. The sound of her own voice cut through the echo in the cabin. She now knew what it meant when your blood ran cold. Right before her very eyes, this man, muscular, large, okay, good-looking if she had to admit. Too good-looking. But that's not what she was noticing now, not at all. Creaking started. The sounds of sinew as it began to stretch, and crunching, the noise made by bones as they began to shift and move, lengthening, broadening, thickening. Yes, Dakotah knew the sounds too well. She had seen them exhibited at the compound by her captors and the children who were her fellow prisoners. She fumbled to rise, tripping over her own feet in her haste and her fear. She couldn't even get onto her feet. She scrambled away from him, crab-crawling toward the couch. But the whole time she was moving, she kept her eyes glued on him. The giant man who'd been at the door, the man she'd shot, was now a large bear covered with thick white fur. His fur gleamed, shiny, even in the dim lighting of the cabin. A red pattern that looked like one of those ink splotches on paper grew on the bear's chest, except it was not black ink but crimson blood. Using the couch's armrest, she pulled herself to her feet. No sooner had she risen than a cramp seized hold of her, doubling Dakotah with pain. Taking a deep breath, letting it out slowly, she waited for the sharpness of the agony to subside. As soon as it had waned and become barely tolerable, she wondered what she should do. This guy probably worked for those guys. This guy is here to kill me. He could be one of the good guys, right? Unsure, she made the only decision she could. She had to get out of here. Another cramp had her redoubling.
Chapter 6. Braden was confused. He was lying on the floor. What the hell is going on? He grabbed his chest and was surprised to see his hand come back full of blood. She shot him. She really shot him. She hovered near him, but he couldn't concentrate on what she was doing or saying. Reality swirled around him. And then he felt something he had never felt before. His bear was pushing him out, taking control, trying to morph. No, no, no. No way this is happening. The bear never took control without Braden giving it to him. Braden pushed back his bear, but for the first time ever, his bear overpowered him. His roars completely filled Braden's mind, drowning out the woman's panicked panting. No matter how hard Braden pushed, his bear pushed harder. Braden surrendered to the shift, knowing it had to be for the best. He hadn't taken a hit like this, not even in the military, where he wore protective covering. He'd taken a round in his chest, and the bear needed to heal him as quickly as possible. But Braden did not want to heal. Hibernating in order to heal would put him in a very vulnerable position. The woman was stirring around the room. He could hear her, though his bear had taken him into a semi-conscious state. Braden concentrated, trying to listen to what she was doing. I told him not to. Her voice was low, her breathing shallow. He heard her grunt with pain. What was that about? He put his superior shifter hearing to work, even though his bear would not allow him to use or take over the rest of his body. He listened for her pulse. It was racing. And then he heard something else. Holy shit. Another pulse. She's pregnant. He listened more intently. There it was, a second heartbeat, definitely that of a baby. Braden breathed deeply and held his breath so he could analyze the air, receiving confirmation. Definitely pregnant. Maybe that was why she was so afraid. Maybe she thought he would hurt her baby. And then the next fact hit him, fell on him like a ton of bricks. That was not a human baby. She was pregnant with a shifter's baby. Something else hit him. She was in a state of panic. Her scent gave it away. The kind of panic that would make a person's judgment and memory faulty. Hope she doesn't do anything crazy. As if shooting him wasn't crazy. She said it was an accident. I need to call someone to help him, she muttered. He wished he could speak. He wished he could tell her not to call anyone. He could not afford to be found as a shifter. If the authorities found a polar bear, it would be one thing, and granted it would be newsworthy. But if they found out that the polar bear was a shifter, he would end up in a cage in a laboratory somewhere. She continued talking. No, I don't. What if he's one of them? Them, he wondered. Who is them? They can't find me. They just can't. She was pacing at a rapid rate, but there was something wrong with her gait. It was as if she was shuffling with every other step. Was it the baby? And then her words became more faint. And even more faint and more so. He was fading. And though he was fading, at the same time he could sense his bear was relinquishing control of his body and beginning to shift Braden back into his human form. Surely he had not healed enough for the bear to leave him in his human body.
Chapter 7. Dakotah paced the cabin's wooden floors. She could barely walk at times because every third step it seemed the stitching of her stomach would jerk her abdomen into a frenzy of pain. She kept her eyes on the bear, fearful he would wake at any moment and kill her with one swipe of that mighty paw. What am I supposed to do? Half of her wanted to help the person she might have killed, the other half wanted to take the weapon and put the end of it against the bear's head and pull the trigger, thus guaranteeing her baby's safety. Yeah, right, like I could kill anybody. She wrung her hands together nervously, clenching them into sweaty fists and then rubbing them on her thighs. There really was no option, she would have to leave. But how was she supposed to do that? That bear was blocking the door. When he had shifted into his bear form, he had become so huge that she would not be able to get by him and outside without touching him. She studied the monstrous being before her. It moved. Suddenly she gasped and reached for the weapon. Those sounds, so familiar and yet still so foreign, heralded the beginning of his change. His body became less ursine, compacting again into a man. His face shortened, his jaw reset. And now he was a man again. A very attractive man, who looked quite a bit paler than he did when he first walked in. She waited a brief moment, to make sure he didn't jump up and attack her. No movement at all. A chiseled jaw, full lips, cheekbones angled perfectly and a thick neck. And how could that face look so innocent, and yet look like such a predator? Really? Is this what I'm going to be doing, while this guy is getting ready to wake and kill me? Could he wake up? She approached him cautiously, knelt next to him, as far away as she could but still able to touch him. She unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it away from his flesh. A sensation traveled through her. A sense of safety. Her baby moved in her stomach, not a violent kick, just soft movement. That's odd. She pushed her thoughts away, so she could deal with the situation at hand. Wanting to check on the wound, she leaned in a fraction. The spot where the round had entered was sealing, though it was still a very angry, puckered wound. His body was sheer perfection, even though bloody in some areas. I should help him. I should clean this wound. Reaching for his shirt tail, she tried to wipe some of the now congealing blood away. She stared at his flesh. He had scars, white raised scars, several inches long, that ran along the side of his rib cage and abdomen. She looked at his chest and found the same scars. The scars were not random. They were placed on his flesh, running parallel to each other, evenly spaced. Horrified, she bit back her gasp at the thought that anyone had done this to someone on purpose. Whoever did this was no different than the bastards that did what they did to me. The man made a small sound, a groan. Dakotah shuffled backward. In his unconscious state, the man gritted his teeth, making a horrible grinding sound. Then he clenched his fists and unclenched them, the tendons in his arms popping. It was as if he was in horrible pain. Or maybe remembering something horrible. When she noticed the changes happening to his scars, Dakotah shoved the heel of her palm against her mouth to keep from crying out. She flinched and fell back. The long white scars, though previously barely noticeable, had begun to change colors, going from an angry purple to a deeper red, then back to white, then purple again. What the hell is going on here? She whispered. Those look like burn marks. Burn marks that had healed over but were coming back? How did that work? Her stomach seized. It felt like someone had attached her stomach muscles to a car and hit the gas. She fell forward on her hands and knees, breathing fast, shallow breaths. Panic set in. Panic and irrationality, fueled by a desperate need to protect her unborn baby. She had to get out of here. This guy was a shapeshifter. He was just like the guys who had been hurting her. The guys who? Panic set in, making her stomach feel like it was in the pledges of a vice. She couldn't afford to be found. She thought about the other woman who'd been at the compound with her months and months ago. She did not want them to do to her what they did to that woman. The captors took her baby away and the woman's body out. Dakotah never saw her again. No. That cannot happen to me. She noticed the keys next to where he had fallen. Did a double take. I'm sorry. She could not afford to be taken. And why was she apologizing to him anyway? He was probably one of those bastards. What if he isn't? He'll be fine. Still wondering where he got the scars, she slipped out of the cabin and jumped into the truck, started it, popped it into reverse and threw gravel in her haste to pull out. Within seconds, she was out of the driveway and onto a dirt road that would lead to the hell out of here. That's all she knew. Dakotah was going to go as far as she could with whatever gas this truck had in it. She glanced at the gauge. Quarter tank. That's a start. She tried to tell herself to slow down, not take the curve so quickly. She also wanted to be as far away as possible from this place and all shifters. Before she could slow down, a severe cramp struck her. She jerked the wheel hard. Too hard. She tried to overcompensate, jerking again. Dakotah lost control of the car. It spun, rolled, flipped down the mountain. No seatbelt. She was trying to protect the baby by holding on to anything she could and making herself as much a protective ball as she could. The final flip was horrible. Every part of her body felt on fire. It hurt to breathe and it was pitch black. The truck's engine quit, and the silence of the dark forested mountain was the only reality she had in the hell which had claimed her body. Realizing she was trapped and hurt, she knew she had to get out of the vehicle but couldn't see a thing. What if there were wolves or mountain lions or anything like that? She should stay where she was. She really had no choice. Within seconds, she blacked out.
Chapter 8. Braden had felt himself being picked up, jostled, and moved. And he knew he'd been taken to a medical facility because he could smell the odors that only came from hospitals and clinics. He wanted to roll over, but as soon as he moved, all he could do was flinch because of the pain in his chest. It slowly occurred to him, as grogginess faded, that he had not been asleep. He'd been out like a light. He opened his eyes, squinting against the brightness in the room. The first face he saw was his nephew's. Bain, he croaked the word out. Bain was looking at him intently, his light blue gaze concerned. Who shot you? Where am I? Braden winced from the effort it took to breathe deeply. You're at Doc's clinic. Memories of the night before. Or was it 2 days ago? Or maybe it was a few hours. He had no idea how long it had been, but memories of a woman, beautiful, olive-skinned, fiery, and pregnant. Where is she? He shoved his elbows down and used them to prop himself up. What happened to her? She. Doc stepped into view. He couldn't tell them. He didn't want her to get in trouble, even though she shot him. How do you feel? Doc asked. Not too bad. Bain laughed. Sure. For someone who took a shot to the chest. Braden tried to put on a smile. He had to get the hell out of here and find that woman. There was something about her that haunted him. The image of her was engraved into his mind as surely as if it had been tattooed there. Or burned into him. What about the scars? Doc asked. Bain crossed his arms over his chest, plastered a very unforgiving look on his face. Yeah. What about the scars? So maybe Braden never told Bain about the scars, about that whole incident. He didn't feel bad about it. The kid, okay, maybe not a kid, but still more like a kid brother to Braden, Bain had enough problems in his life. He didn't need it complicated by his uncle's misadventures in the Middle East. Braden looked away from Bain's piercing gaze and glanced out the window. He studied the mountain range he could call home in a heartbeat. It wasn't something I wanted to share. He turned toward his nephew, unsure if he should or even could ask for forgiveness. Bain nodded, a hurt look on his face. I guess that not sharing thing runs in the family. Braden nodded. This was his sister's son, and yet he loved him more than he would have loved any brother if he'd had any alive. I'm sure as hell not doing a very good job of taking care of him. First, I let him get involved with that blood debt business. Then, I can't even save his ass getting ambushed by that damned Italian. Braden scratched the scruffiness of his unshaved face. The sound was loud in the almost empty clinic. It was time he told Bain something. At least a little bit. The Middle East. Doc winced visibly. Fuck. Bain turned away and grabbed the rail of the bed. I had no idea. Of course not. Braden hadn't been about to share that with anyone. That had been the stuff nightmares were made of. Those scars are symmetrical, man-made. Doc's voice was a low growl, as if his grizzly was surfacing. Yeah. Braden didn't elaborate on his days as a POW, when hiding his bear during the torture he endured damn near killed him, but shifting would have been worse on so many levels for him and his team. Braden was saved from the discussion by the appearance of Tanner and Teague Navarro. After a soft knock, they popped their heads in the door. Sheriff's office called. The truck was found flipped over, Tanner said. Everybody turned and looked at Braden. He glanced at the sheet crumpled between his fists. Wait a minute. Doc frowned. Truck's flipped over. You've been shot. What gives? Inside Braden, his bear began to growl, a low sound that built to a roar. Braden knew exactly what his bear was feeling. He felt the same way. He didn't want her to be hurt. There was something about her. Something he wanted to protect. He had to see her again. Had to know more about her. His chest hurt, and it had nothing to do with that damned round he took. Anyone in the truck? He asked Tanner. Did anyone say? Should there be? Teague cocked his head and studied Braden. Braden shrugged. Joe walked in, no knock since the door was open already. He took one look at Braden, then turned to Doc. I guess this is why you're not answering your phone. Braden's been shot. Why? What's up? Joe stepped closer to Braden. Gunshot. In the valley. What the hell? Who shot you? That's what we're figuring out, Doc said with a frown. What's going on? Ivan and Sarah okay? Yeah. Sarah and Ivan are fine. Griz sent me, said he couldn't reach you on the phone. Then I couldn't either. He needs you. Something about a hurt woman. I think he said she was pregnant. He said she was injured. Braden flew up abruptly. Doc put his hand on Braden's shoulder. Bain put his hand on Braden's other shoulder, restraining him. Whoa, Doc said. Where do you think you're going? I need to check on her. Braden tried to shrug their hands off his shoulders. They tightened their grips. Check on who? Bain asked. Braden tightened his lips into a line. He wasn't going to tell them anything. An uncomfortable silence filled the room while Doc, Tanner, Teague, Joe, and Bain stared at Braden expectantly. The silence was interrupted by Doc's phone vibrating. The sound was loud to Braden's shifter ears, breaking the uncomfortable quiet. Without taking his eyes off Braden, Doc put the phone to his ear after swiping the screen to answer it. This is Doc. Everyone stared at Doc while he listened on the phone. Okay, thanks. Doc swiped to end the call. I won't need to go after all. She must be dead. Everything within Braden collapsed. His entire world shattered. All hope vanished. That's all this could mean. If they didn't need Doc, she was beyond help. Dead. He let that thought sink in, felt it plunge to the very depths of him. He didn't even stop to analyze why it bothered him so much. That this woman's death, a woman whose name he did not even know, a woman who shot him, crushed him. He felt his bear's spirit deflate as deeply as he felt his own. A long exhaled breath escaped him. He stared out the window, and suddenly found himself hating the visage of the mountains. There was a silence in the room that made Braden turn away from the view and look at the other men. They were all staring at him. He was used to people staring, those wielding searing hot red-tipped strips of metal right before they placed it on his bare skin. The memories of that and the devastation at the woman's demise was too much. The anger within him reflected in the dirty look he gave them. Doc glanced away from Braden, turning to Joe, Tanner, and Teague. Next to Braden, Bain squeezed his shoulder. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" he asked softly. "It's Dakotah. The woman from the compound," Doc said softly to the other men. Braden's sensitive bear hearing picked up the words. "That must be her name. Dakotah." He rolled the syllables as he spoke them in his head. Doc, Joe, Tanner, and Teague all approached Braden's bed, surrounding him. Doc cleared his throat. He gave Braden a hard look. "If I had to put this together and maybe make a timeline," he crossed his arms over chest, his glower lancing Braden. "I'd say she snuck away from the compound, bowled over Sierra, then found the cabin." Braden did not say a word. He put on his best poker face. Doc continued, "At the cabin she shot you then. I'm guessing she left you dying, took the truck, had a wreck, and now she's with Griz." And still Braden said nothing. Gave away nothing. Doc nodded as if to say, "So be it. She'll need to stand trial. But for now we'll treat her. And Griz is having Sierra come out. Seems he thinks she can be of help with her. She's got mind skills." An eruption of joy overwhelmed Braden. That meant she was still alive. That joy was quickly replaced. A thread of fear laced throughout Braden's veins. He hadn't been able to get past the word, trial. "What do you mean, a trial?" A muscle ticked in Doc's jaw. "Shifter court. She shot a shifter. You. Or did you forget?" Fury replaced fear. "It was an accident. And I loaned her the truck." He gritted his teeth. "No trial." Home. Doc wore a dubious look. "Stay here. Don't leave this room until I tell you that you can." Braden frowned.
Chapter 9. Dakotah was still in that state of semi-sleep, semi-awake. That state where you process before you fully wake. She knew something was wrong before she opened her eyes. If not wrong, then very different. The smell, it smelled clean, antiseptic, like a hospital. And she was lying on sheets, clean, fresh, crisp sheets. These were not the sheets at Deep Hollow, the compound where the shifters kept her captive. No, she definitely wasn't there. Where am I, she wondered, surveying her surroundings. This was a hospital room. Her last memory was driving that truck, and then tipping over into a huge ditch and rolling. The rolling had seemed never-ending. And with that thought came a realization. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She snapped up right to a sitting position, eyes flying open at the same time. "My baby," she whispered in horror. Her baby was not in her. She lost the baby. It was gone. This is my punishment for not wanting it at first. For having doubts. It serves me right to punish me, but why make an innocent baby pay? She shoved her fist into her mouth, biting into her knuckles to dull the pain in her heart. The sound of a baby's cry split her thoughts. Dakotah jumped to her feet, then collapsed to the floor, unable to stand on weak legs. She brought the IV bag and its pole crashing down on her. The door flew open and a big man stood before her, a concerned look on his face. "You were unconscious. While so, your baby came. He's early." "I know you," she said. She'd seen him during the shapeshifter fight at Deep Hollow. "You're one of those. One of them." She jerked the IV out of her arm. "Give me my baby. Now." She didn't care who she had to fight, and if they were shifted into bears, lions, or even a pack of wolves. She wanted her damn baby, and now. She threw herself at him, lunging, aiming for his neck. He held on to her arms at the wrists, immobilizing her. I'm a doctor. Your baby is fine. You can see him. I know where you were. I'm not one of them. She jerked her hand out of his grip. Yes, you are. I saw you change. I saw you turn from a bear into a man. You are one of them. No. I may be the same type as they are, but I am nothing like they are. You're safe here. He released her wrists and took a step back, held his hands up as if to reassure her that he was harmless. Yeah. And I was born yesterday. The room began to spin, but Dakotah ignored it. She wanted her baby. She tensed her legs and leapt toward the door. He was still talking. I'm not like the ones at that compound. I'll take you to your baby. He's hungry. He's premature, but... He seized her by the arm just as she had gotten past him. That brought her up short. How do I know you are not like the ones at Deep Hollow? Again she jerked on her arm to free herself. No luck. His grip was a steel band. Then it hit her. He said but. He said her baby was hungry, premature, but... What do you mean but? But what? You hate shifters. He paused, rubbed his jaw. Your baby is a shifter. A lion cub shifter. I know that. She shoved at his chest with her free hand, then began to beat on him. A boy. She had a baby boy. Elation didn't have time to sink in, because she had to get her child. But he's still my baby. That's for me to deal with. She raised her hand for another round of pounding on his chest, when he caught her wrists again. You can't deal with that alone. You don't know how to raise a shifter. You don't know how to teach him to shift. That's my problem. And then the emotions, the everything of it, hit Dakotah like a ton of bricks. Tears burst forth, and she was angry with herself for losing control of her emotions. Helpless anger always created tears for her. And she hated that. Which made her angrier. She began to writhe to free herself from his iron grip. The man stepped to the side and raised his hands. You're free to go to your baby, he said softly and indicated the door. They'll come for me. They'll come for my baby. The ones from Deep Hollow? There's no one left there, said another man as he stepped in the door. She looked at the newcomer. This man was even bigger than the first. A big scary man with a large wicked scar that ran across his face. A woman followed him in, holding a bundled baby. Her baby. She handed him to Dakotah. Dakotah studied her baby's face. He was perfect. Beautiful, though so very tiny. You're sure he's okay? The man who said he was a doctor nodded. All of those shifters are dead, said the shifter with the scar. Dakotah looked up from the baby, shook her head. No, the one who will come for me was not there when you were. My baby is his son. That man came in once a week to view the ultrasound. She barely kept the sob from her voice. She lowered her head to nuzzle the baby, but still caught the look exchanged by the two men. The doctor said, Do you know his name? Dakotah raised her lips from the baby's forehead to reply. Chad Pintoso. He lives in California. I heard him tell one of the others at Deep Hollow. The two men again exchanged a look. What? She hugged her baby, taking in his sweet scent. Nothing. The doctor took a step toward the door. Take care of your baby.
Chapter 10. Braden had been told to stay in the room and not to interfere. Everyone else cleared out, except Bain, who Braden surmised had been left behind to make sure Braden followed instructions. But Braden knew she was there, at the clinic, within close proximity. He knew this as surely as he knew his own bear. He scented her. He also knew because his bear had imprinted on her pulse. Seems his bear had also imprinted on her baby's pulse. Braden knew the baby had been born and was alive. But there was more than that to it. All Braden's nerve endings whirred on hyper-alert. Dakotah. His body and his bear were reacting to her. And though he wasn't happy with their request, he knew seeing him would give Dakotah stress. And so he was quiet and obedient, though his jaw was set and his fists clenched. Until he heard her cry out. He sat up. Bain rose to his feet. Don't do it. I need to see her. Bain shook his head. You don't know the conditions she was in. You don't know what she's been through. I think I can imagine. Especially since she shot me. But he couldn't tell Bain that, not when he'd been denying it all this time. Have you seen her? How's the baby? She's a survivor. So is the baby. So your Bear Canyon Valley friends are going to keep me here, as a prisoner. Actually, Doc said you're free to go. Just ask that you don't disturb her. Bain didn't have to clarify who her was. Can you at least tell me their plans for her? They're going to take her next door to Doc and May's house. Keep an eye on her, make sure the baby is okay. So I can just go? Whenever I want. Bain dug in his pocket, fishing out a set of keys. Take mine. They cleaned the cabin. It's ready whenever you are. Just like that. Bain nodded and walked out of the room. Braden could hear them, murmuring amongst themselves, even though they were a couple rooms away. Every now and then, he heard his name mentioned. He heard Dakotah's name mentioned. A confusion, unlike any he'd ever experienced, set in. His head felt as if filled with cotton. It was his bear, Braden realized. His bear was fighting for control, and the aftermath was leaving Braden in a state of disarray emotionally and mentally. His bear was driving him crazy. Every breath Dakotah took, every pulse beat of her baby made Braden's bear roar. And so Braden left, his mind on Dakotah, his heart with Dakotah, and his logic held hostage by his bear. He wanted to ask anyone questions about Dakotah and the baby, but he couldn't talk to the other shifters and their mates who came and went. He was confused by his bear's actions and reactions, and he was confused by the whole situation. Best thing he could do would be to go for a run in the forest to clear his head. He had to get out of there. It was the scream that woke Braden. He bolted upright in the dark room of Joe's cabin. Then he realized it was his own scream of agony that had awakened him. The scars on his body felt on fire, much as they felt every night after he fell asleep. There was something different about the scars tonight. They tingled in a way they never had. Confused, he frowned in the darkness of the room. A darkness that held no barrier to sight. His shifter sight made everything as clear as day. The hairs on his neck rose, every nerve ending buzzed with a vigilance he'd never experienced before. Something had happened. He could feel it, sense it, knew it. And his bear knew it too. In Braden's mind, his bear's roars overwhelmed. Dakotah. It had to be her. Braden didn't have to think twice about a plan of action. In fact, there was no plan. He was all action. He was in Bain's Jeep and headed down the road before he even realized he forgot his shirt. He never slept with a shirt on. The burning sensations of his scars were bad enough on their own, but with material brushing his skin, they were sheer hell. The closer he got to May and Doc's house, the stronger the tingling sensation became. He arrived at the clinic and softly patted around the building. He found nothing amiss, and he began the short walk to the house next door. He hadn't even made it to the sidewalk that led to the front door when his tingling felt like tiny electric shocks were pinging it. His bear roared, and Braden knew he had to listen. It had been the same way when they'd been in battle. Braden wasn't sure how his bear had these perceptions, but they had never led him astray. Taking a deep breath, he assessed the scents. Woods, evergreen, mulch, so many different aromas. The next scent assaulted him, as if it was a physical attack. Dakotah. And then another odor, one he knew too well. Blood. He immediately took off, turning it over to his bear. Shifting into his animal mid-stride, a tactic he had perfected while serving in the military. His shifting was silent, as he had been taught. The bone stretching, the sinew elongating, all of it quiet and practically instantaneous. He was in his polar bear form, a massive white being, making its way through the forest, loping at a powerful speed, an undefeatable predator. He stayed on her scent, getting stronger and stronger, and deeper into the woods. A form crumpled and in white lay against a tree. The smell of blood was strong, permeating his fears, making them grow. He picked up speed and stopped before her. She was not conscious. And no baby. Fuck. He shifted into his human form quickly and knelt next to her. There was blood on her forehead. Yes, this was definitely her. And no baby. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe she left the baby at Doc's place. Would she, though? Would she abandon her child? After the things he overheard her saying, and the gut feeling he got about her, no. He couldn't believe she would do that. He put his hand on her shoulder. Dakotah. She moaned low, lifted her head, and opened her eyes. It seemed she was trying to focus. Her expression registered recognition. You. And then her face crumpled, screwing up into an ugly cry. My baby. They took my baby. And with that she collapsed. He caught her just before her head hit the tree she had been leaning against. Holding her, breathing her scent in, the blood on her head assaulting his senses, making his bear crazy for revenge, Braden pushed the bear aside. The baby. We have to find out what happened to the baby. He forced his bear to move past rage and the overwhelming odor of blood, to concentrate on the baby's particular scent. The signals were mixed. The baby had not been with her out here. But there was a trail left by the baby's scent. Braden raised his head, inhaled deeply, letting the various aromas sit on his senses while his lungs burned with the effort of holding his breath long enough to process. There. He picked it up. It was faint as hell, but there it was. Another shifter. One he didn't recognize, out of all the Bear Canyon Valley shifters that he'd met thus far. The burning grew in his lungs, setting them on fire with the effort, but still he held it in deep, processing. Hyena. A hyena shifter. And so faint. Hunter's block, he realized. The shifter had used Hunter's block, and it had just begun to wear off. I'll be damned. He looked down at the still unmoving Dakotah. Her dark hair splayed across his arm. Her eyes were closed, as if she were asleep. And if it weren't for how ashen her skin was under her dark complexion, and the trickle of blood on her forehead, he'd think she were sleeping. Braden was consciously aware of the fact that his bear was synchronizing his heartbeat to hers. The whole time Braden had been trying to assess the sense. We're not bonded, he warned his bear. Don't put the cart before the horse. His bear growled in response, a warning snarl to back off. Wait. What was that? Braden felt his heartbeat begin to slow. It was slowing to match her declining heartbeat. No. Fuck no. Her heartbeat was becoming weaker, fainter. He couldn't lose her. Why was her blood pressure dipping? Why was her heartbeat getting slower? He needed to get her to Doc's. Now. Hoisting her carefully into a fireman's carry, Braden jogged as steadily as he could without jarring her until he finally reached Doc and May's. His breathing came out in gasps, his body drenched in sweat as he hit the door with his shoulder, not bothering to knock, cracking wood and loosening the knob. The door gave immediately. He glanced at Dakotah. She was unmoving, still out. Doc and May ran into the living room, Doc carrying a weapon that looked more like a mace than a bat. He lowered it when he saw Braden carrying Dakotah. What's happened? She was outside. He sucked air in. Her head. He turned so that Doc could see the wound. Doc moved Dakotah's hair aside. Not good. Let's get her where I can take a look at her. What about the baby? May's hand flew to her mouth, and she ran out of the room. Follow May. That's the room Dakotah and the baby are staying in. I'll take care of her in there. Doc led the way. Braden followed, carrying Dakotah sideways through the hallway. May came flying out of the room, her eyes wide, her face pale. The baby. He's gone. May's bottom lip trembled. Set her down here, Doc said to Braden. May, babe. May turned his way, a tear making its way down her cheek. Her dark eyes flashed with a blue fire. In the distance, thunder rolled. Doc took May's hand. Call Grant and Griz. Have them reach out to the Navarro brothers and Joe. Let me see what's going on with Dakotah. He locked eyes with Braden. Can you stay with May? Braden looked down at Dakotah. The last thing he wanted was to leave her side. But he knew Doc was worried about May. Dakotah's eyes fluttered. Doc waved him away. Go. I don't know what her reaction will be to you being here. She shot you after all. But I'd appreciate if you look after May. I'll take care of Dakotah. Braden contained his anger and the accusations he wanted to hurl at Doc that Dakotah had slipped out of their house, that her baby was missing. He didn't know enough about what happened yet. He shut the lid on the fury that wanted to erupt from both him and his bear. May was in the kitchen on the cell phone, pacing, her voice raised. I don't know. Griz isn't answering his phone. She glanced at Braden, then turned her attention back to pacing. Can you also call? A knock came from the front door. She looked at Braden, her eyes wide. Braden put his finger over his lip for her to be silent and raised his other hand, indicating she should stay. I'll see who it is, he whispered. Who could it be anyway? How could anyone she called be here already? He snagged Doc's mace-like weapon from the wall he'd propped it against and took long strides toward the door. One deep breath. He raised the weapon, ready to swing, and put his other hand on the knob. He took another deep breath and braced for action. Twisting it slowly, he jerked it open. Shit. Language, said the big shifter in front of him, soaking wet, a scar slicing his face in half, and a tiny bundle in his arms swaddled in a baby blanket. A scream blew up behind Braden. He half-whirled, keeping his eye on the drenched shifter before him, while he processed the visage of a very pale, struggling Dakotah being held back by Doc. The baby's shrieks cut through the noise, raising it to a new level. Holy shit, Braden muttered. My baby. Dakotah's screech almost came to eardrum-splitting level. She jerked loose from Doc's grip and lunged for Griz. Griz had a perplexed look on his face. That's when Braden noticed it. Oh my God. Is that blood? This came from Dakotah, who must have noticed the blood on Griz's arms and shirt at the same time as Braden. The baby's fine, Griz said, holding the child out to his mother. But why the hell didn't anyone tell me the baby is an elemental? Every time he cried, I'd get doused with a downpour of rain. Once, it actually hailed. Look at this shit. He glanced at the baby. Oops. Language. Sorry, little fella. The expression on Griz's face was almost comical, and Braden was sure one day they'd all laugh about it, but today not so much, what with all the concern about Dakotah and the baby's well-being. I was going to tell everyone I believed he was an elemental, May said. But I've never seen one so young. I figured it out earlier when his eyes went blue, but I thought it could be because he's a newborn. So how'd you get bloody, Griz? Braden asked, keeping a cautious eye on Dakotah as she held the baby. Dakotah looked a little shaky. Braden took her arm, led her to the chair, and helped her sit in the plush upholstery. She looked up at Braden. First, she studied his face, then she turned her attention to his body, focusing on his chest. You're okay, she said almost with an exhale of relief. Deep within Braden, his heart and his bear did a little flip, happy that she cared. Yeah. I'm sorry. Braden raised his head slightly, stopping her. You didn't know.
Chapter 11. Dakotah stared at the massive man she'd shot not long ago. The concern in his eyes was evident. She wanted to talk to him. She felt like she had so much she needed to say, But how could that be when she barely knew him? And yet, looking into his eyes, there was something that said she'd known him for a long time. Confused, she focused her gaze on her son so the man could not read the expression in her eyes. Braden. This came from May, who was the wife of the doctor, as far as Dakotah could tell. A few months ago, she would not even have believed shapeshifters existed. And until a few hours ago, she would not have believed that any of them were good. And yet when she woke, her baby was gone, and she went out to find him, only to be attacked in the darkness and left to die. The big man she'd shot, the one May just called Braden, had saved her life and brought her here. And as if that wasn't enough, the other giant shapeshifter with a scar that made him look menacing had held her baby as if he was the most precious treasure and brought him back safely. Tears welled in her eyes, slowly escaping and dropping onto the baby's blanket. There was a knock at the door. Dakotah's eyes widened. She grabbed the baby tighter, so tightly he let out a little squeal. "I'm sorry, baby." She put her lips on his forehead, helping him quiet down. "Griz." Doc reached for a wicked-looking bat type of weapon. He raised it, then indicated the door with a nod. "You got that?" The man with the scar, Griz, inclined his head once and stepped closer to the door. He opened it. There stood the same woman she had kicked and shoved when she tried to get out of her vehicle. The woman with the white hair and eerie light eyes. So she was one of them. Dakotah waited to see if the interaction would be friendly. Griz hugged the woman. "Sierra, I'm glad you came out." "Of course," the woman said as she stepped into the room, her eyes zeroing in on Dakotah and the baby. "I figured you would need me." "You figured right." May gave the woman a hug. The woman, her white blonde hair pulled back into a braid, approached Dakotah. "I'm Sierra. I think our first meeting was not underneath the best of circumstances." Dakotah felt her face heat, to think that this woman was so gracious about the way she treated her. "I apologize. I didn't know. If I were one of the ones at Deep Hollow." Sierra said. "It can't be easy for you, having gone through what you have with them, than this. And now the baby, coming early. He's fine, you know. Even though he was born early, his shifter heritage will help him." With every step the woman had taken, she had gotten closer to Dakotah and the baby. And with every step, it felt as though a wave of serenity washed over Dakotah. The panic she had felt, the indecision, the insecurity, all of that faded away, being pulled out like a slow tide. "What's happening?" Dakotah stared at the woman. Sierra's eyes were glowing, and deep within her irises there seemed to be a kaleidoscope. Dakotah rubbed her eyes. Was she seeing things? She looked again. No. The woman's eyes were definitely glowing. "What are you?" Griz stepped closer. "Sierra is a distant cousin of mine, and she has special skills. Those skills allow her to help. You trust me, Dakotah?" Dakotah glanced from Griz to the baby and back to Griz. He had saved her baby's life. That blood on his shirt meant he had to fight someone to help her son. "I do trust you." "Then do not be concerned, Sierra will not hurt you. None of us will." Looking at the gentle giant before her, his eyes filled with sympathy, though he could easily have snapped her like a twig, Dakotah felt she could trust him with her life. After all, he'd saved her infant's life. Then the strangest thought occurred to her, seemed to come out of the blue actually. "My baby doesn't even have a name." "Your name is Griz?" she asked the scarred shifter. He smiled, then let out a small chuckle. "That's what I've been called for most of my life. But my name is Larson." "Larson." The name rolled off her tongue so easily. "Larson," she repeated. In her arms the baby chortled. "I think he likes the name Larson." Dakotah made a soothing clicking sound. Griz leaned in, chucked the baby under the chin. "I think he likes his Uncle Griz." "Why wouldn't he? You saved his life. You protected him from the lion. Did you kill him?" Dakotah found herself hoping Chad and his shifter lion self were dead. Not just for vengeance, but for the safety of her baby. Griz frowned. "Lion? What lion?" Dakotah frowned, confused. I scented a hyena near where I found you, Braden added. Yeah, it was a hyena I had to kill. Griz looked at the baby. I had to kill him. There was no way he was going to let me bring that baby back. What's his name, anyway? The whole walk over here, all I would call him was Baby. Maybe that's why he made it rain on me. Griz smiled a crooked smile because of his scar. Name? Dakotah looked at the little one in her arms. She glanced back at the giant man. Her voice was choked up and she said, His name is Larson, of course. Griz's eyes flickered wide just a split second as she caught him off guard. He put his hand on his chest. Larson? After me? I don't know any other Larsons. Seeing his emotional response, and this man who had seemed so tough and stoic, made the lump in her throat grow larger. She glanced at Braden, who was looking at her with an expression that scared the daylights out of her, at the same time, filled her with feelings she couldn't begin to grasp. Braden gave a slight nod as if he approved. And to Dakotah's surprise, his approval meant a lot to her. That's an honor. Griz dropped to one knee next to Sierra and May, in front of Dakotah. He put his hand on the baby's forehead and said, He needs a godfather. I volunteer for that position. Dakotah couldn't help it. At that moment she burst into tears, and then the house's roof was pelted by large raindrops. There goes little Larson, Griz laughed. Thought you were gonna soak me again, didn't you? A smile came to the baby's face. On a serious note, Braden said. If you killed the hyena, where's the lion? Griz shrugged. Maybe he's not coming. Chapter 12. Hysterical laughter burst out of Dakotah. The baby winced and flinched at the shrillness of her laughter. You're crazy if you think Chad is not coming for this baby. He came every week to make sure it was healthy and to see it on the ultrasound. Chad's not giving up on this baby, as long as his vile heart is still beating. And I hope I get to help his heart stop, Braden thought. How's this baby an elemental? You're not one. He studied Dakotah's face. Are you? Dakotah shook her head. I think his dad is. But? She shrugged. I could be wrong. The doctors gave me some injections. I don't know what was in them. Griz whistled under his breath in disbelief. What the fuck, Braden uttered. They'll pay, Griz said. One way or another, they will pay. They already did, Doc reminded him. We took them all down at Deep Hollow, remember? Nah. We didn't, or there'd be no one after the baby. Clearly that lion shifter must still be around. I can't believe they did that to little Larson, May's dark eyes flashed blue. What do you mean? Braden was confused. You're an elemental. You do fine. I'm not a shifter elemental. Dakotah sat up straighter in the chair. What do you mean? What does that mean? May shook her head. Please don't shield me from the truth. I can't handle any more shocks. I need to know what I'm facing, what baby Larson is facing. Doc put his arm around May. You should tell her. It's only fair she knows what she's up against. Just as Bryson and Anya need to know what Pepper has to face. Pepper? Griz asked. You mean Lonnie's friend Pepper, the one that lives next to Lonnie and Cross? The intuitive. No. Different Pepper, Doc explained. We're gonna have two Peppers in the valley? Griz smiled. That won't get confusing. No, May laughed softly. We're taking Anya, Bryson, and Bryson's daughter Pepper to Colorado when we go see the Order of Elementals. Astra and Kane are going too. Dakotah tipped her head to the side, trying to process all of this. Why are you taking them there? Well, I'm hoping the Order can help them cope with their elementals and keep them from killing the shifter. Shifter elemental hybrids rarely make it to adulthood. The elemental often kills the shifter's animal. If one's shifter animal dies, the body that housed that animal can die too. What? Dakotah flew out of that seat, as if she'd been ejected from a fighter plane's cockpit. The baby screeched in protest. What do you mean shifter elemental hybrids rarely make it to adulthood. My baby, we need to get help too. May patted Dakotah's shoulder. Join us? We can get some help for Larson at the order. I'd like to. And Dakotah really would like to. She would definitely do that, except she didn't know where she would be when that happened or how she could do that. She looked down at Larson's innocent face. I'll find a way. The baby locked eyes with her, and then opened his mouth and released the largest wail she'd ever heard. At the same time, in the background, thunder rumbled. Doc laughed. I think he's hungry. Excuse me. Dakotah turned toward the bedrooms. We'll be back in a few.
Chapter 13. Braden watched Dakotah leave the room with baby Larson and found himself wishing he could go with her. The idea of her being out of sight, even for a second, even in the next room, bothered him. How are you recuperating? Doc asked. Braden shrugged. Shifter blood. Fast healing. What can I say? Doc nodded. The look in Doc's eye concerned him. It did not bode well. Now more than ever, he wished he were somewhere else. Speaking of healing, Doc said. What's the situation with those scars? Braden shook his head. He didn't want to be rude, but hadn't he already made it clear that he didn't want to discuss this? That's not really a story I feel like recounting. I understand you don't want to talk about how you got them, Doc countered. But would you like to explain why they keep flaring up and looking like they're new? And then they heal, only to reappear again. This happened several times when you were unconscious. He shrugged. I wish I knew. Mind if I take a look? Griz stepped closer. Braden studied the grizzly bear shifter. What with his large scar that ran the distance of his face, maybe he would understand. Sure. Go ahead. He raised his shirt. Griz eyeballed the scars, moving from one to another without touching. Finally, he looked up at Sierra. Got any ideas? Sierra nodded. I've seen this once before. She turned her attention to Braden. When did you get the scars? Or rather, where? Just what he did not want to discuss. The more Braden thought about it, the more his mind dwelled on it, the worse they became every night, when they transformed into angry lacerations and burns. I can't help you if you won't discuss them with me, Sierra said. I was a POW in the Middle East. I was tortured by a bunch of bastards that wanted to know more about my unit. What can you tell me about the people who did this to you? You have an idea, don't you? Griz said to Sierra. That depends. She looked back at Braden. Anything you can tell me about them will be helpful. I have no idea. It's like they scrubbed my memory clean in certain parts. But I have a full recollection of what they put me through. It's still so vivid that I feel the burns as strongly as I did when they inflicted them. And they come back as if they were freshly made. You can't remember the men at all. They wore masks. They weren't all Middle Eastern. One had the brightest, bluest eyes I've ever seen. The scars began to sear his flesh. Braden briefly closed his eyes against the pain, only to be met with a memory that he'd pushed so far away, he was startled it had re-emerged. He pushed it back again. Sierra chewed on her bottom lip. What about medicine? They gave me an injection. Wait a second. Braden stared into Sierra's face. His eyes. Why didn't I see it before? They're just like yours. Sierra nodded. That nod bothered him. She wasn't surprised. You know something, don't you? Fury began its rise at the idea there were answers, but no one was telling him what they were. She didn't respond to Braden's question, but rather looked at Griz. Griz nodded. I wondered as much. Anger blossomed stronger in Braden. What the hell weren't they telling him? Anybody want to fill me in? He's an intuitive, Griz said. He, Braden thought. He, the one with the light eyes that burned him. He pointed to Sierra. Like her. Sierra gasped. Nothing like me. Her pale cheeks reddened with anger. He's not an intuitive. He's a counterintuitive. 2 large tears escaped from white eyelashes and cascaded down her face. And he's my brother. Griz wrapped his arm around her. The path he has chosen is not your fault. If he is going to practice evil, you cannot take responsibility for it. No. But I can try to stop it. To stop him. Griz shook his head. There's only one way to stop him. More tears joined the others on Sierra's face. She sniffed and wiped them away with a suddenness that spoke of a finality. Braden knew all about sibling issues. He'd seen that with his nephew Bain and his brother Vay. I can reverse this so it stops happening, she told Braden. He opened his mouth to ask her a question, but didn't get too far. The sound of thunder and a crash followed by a piercing scream interrupted anything he was going to say and every thought he had. The scream came from the room that contained Dakotah and the baby. Braden leapt into action, springing for the door behind which they were. Closely on his heels came the others. He flung the door open and beheld a screaming Dakotah in the corner clutching a wailing Larson to her chest. The double door that led to the veranda was missing its panes, and shattered glass covered the wooden floor. Braden looked from Dakotah to the window, then back to Dakotah, and wondered how the window was broken, and why she was still screaming about it. He didn't have to wonder long. A bolt of lightning flew through the window, and with eerie precision, struck the flooring next to Dakotah's feet. The wood split, leaving a gash and blackened edges from which smoke rose. What the hell? Braden crossed the distance between them swiftly, and put his arm around Dakotah to escort her from the room. He wondered if baby Larson was responsible for these unnatural acts of nature. A large tan figure with a hint of black moved so quickly before Braden it was almost a blur. The figure had leapt through the window and lit in front of Braden and Dakotah, head thrown back in a mighty roar. It was the largest male lion Braden had ever seen. A tawny gold color, topped with an ebony mane, glared at Braden. Morphing almost as swiftly, or maybe even more swiftly than Braden did, with the most minimal of sounds, as if the shifter practiced his skills, the lion became a man. He was a tall man with yellow eyes that glittered as if made of crystals, ebony hair flowed to his shoulders, and skin the color of highly polished oak. Braden knew immediately, this had to be the one Dakotah had mentioned earlier. Chad something or other. I want my son, the man said between tightly clenched jaws. The air sizzled and crackled, hopping sounds that made Larson cry. Make him stop, the man said. He's not your son. Dakotah's voice was firm. And he's a baby. You can't just turn him off. You're scaring him. The man tipped his head to the side, raised his hands palms out. He dropped them swiftly, and a bolt of lightning followed, striking the nightstand, splitting it in half. A wisp of smoke rose from each half of the severed furniture. Don't threaten her. Braden stepped between the lion shifter and Dakotah. And you think you have a say in this? The shifter snapped his fingers, and from nowhere, accompanied by a sizzling hiss as a warning sign, a bolt of lightning slashed across Braden's arm. Braden looked down, surprised to see a deep wound had been seared by the heat of the shifter's electricity. Deep inside, Braden's bear roared and fought to escape and morph in order to kill the intruder. Despite the pain, Braden maintained control of his bear, pushing his other half back, though he did not know why. What the hell is going on here? Griz stepped forward. Another finger snap, and then another, and the lion shifter had raised a fence around Dakotah made of pure electricity. Lethal, the fence sizzled, a perpetual warning. He's an electric elemental, May said. Very dangerous. It's nice to be recognized for what I am. The lion shifter threw his head back, releasing a roar. It was as if his animal was bursting to come through, so inhuman was his sound. No harm will come to any of you if you release my son into my care. Behind the crackling, sizzling electric fence that rose above her head, Dakotah's eyes widened. Never. Silly human. Silly, silly mortal human. The lion shifter laughed. He turned to face Braden, Griz, and the rest of the shifters. You will lose to my elemental. In the near distance, a rumble of thunder sounded. The lion shifter smiled with delight. My son. My son is making his presence known. Not quite. May's eyes flashed, brown merging with indigo, undulating rich hues, forewarning those who knew. Oh, you are, the lion shifter started to say, but was interrupted. May raised her arms to the ceiling, made a symbol with her fingers, then dropped them swiftly. A large spear of ice formed from thin air and traveled swiftly through the room, embedding itself in the lion shifter's shoulder. The lion roared. You bitch! Blood bloomed around the wound, soaking the shifter's shirt. Be careful who you're calling a bitch, Doc grated between gritted teeth. Oh, and is the grizzly shifter going to hurt the big bad lion shifter? The shifter smiled, his expression looking more like a grimace. He's not alone. Griz stepped into the room. He's an electric elemental, May cautioned them. Very powerful. More powerful than your elemental. The lion shifter laughed, the sound more like the crackling of distant electrical surges. Blood was seeping through the wound created by May's lance of ice as it melted. He raised his hand. The electricity fence surrounding Dakotah dropped as he flicked his fingers toward Doc. A bolt of electricity flew through the air, shimmering pure energy, coursing through the room, and then sliced into Doc's arm. Doc grabbed his arm, a hiss of pain escaping his lips. May gasped.
Chapter 14. Dakotah flinched as the bolt Chad cast must have caused the fence to drop. She bit back the scream at the sight of blood pouring out of the cut Chad had delivered to Doc's arm. She chewed on her bottom lip at the horror before her. A horror she'd brought to these good people. She looked down at Larson's sweet face, calm now in the face of the storm, feeling as if he were secure in the arms of his mother. God, if only that were true. She had to get Larson away. She'd brought death and horror to everyone here, and she had to get away before they were all dead. The best thing she could do was leave before Chad killed her newfound friends. With a glance of regret at Braden, and a hope that she would find understanding and forgiveness in his eyes, she slipped around Chad, clutching Larson tightly to her chest. She exited the door as Griz was shifting into a large grizzly, and Braden was shifting to a polar bear. Doc was quick to follow, and now the room was full of 3 snarling bears and a growling lion. She ran out the bedroom door, then out the front door, leaving the chaos behind. Outside, she found none of the vehicles had keys in them, and she'd be damned if she'd take Larson back inside to find keys. She dashed toward the wooded area, hurling herself into cover of the trees, Larson held closely to her body.
Chapter 15. The speed with which the shifters moved would have been frightening to a human not accustomed to these types of display of power. Hell, Braden thought, as he moved toward the lion shifter, I'm a shifter and still find the scene overwhelming. Within moments, amongst the gnashing of teeth, the flash of lightning, ice bolts, and slashing claws, the fight was over. Braden surveyed the scene before him. The lion shifter was dead. A feat he'd thought impossible, and one he was sure none of them could have done alone. Griz was on the floor, in his human form, legs slashed by a bolt of lightning the lion shifter elemental had cast at him. May was across the room, bandaging Doc's arm. Doc was shrugging her off, telling her, go take care of Griz. Mine's a flesh wound. Griz laughed it off, but Braden could see the pain in his eyes. Braden could relate to that pain. He hadn't said anything, but a steady stream of blood was making its way down his body. He recognized that he was bleeding way too heavily. Years of military service in the war-torn Middle East, yeah, he knew he was in jeopardy. But something else was at the top of his mind. Dakotah. May was walking toward Griz when she looked Braden's way. She slipped out. I saw her. Probably hiding with Larson in the other room. I'm sure she didn't want him to be in the middle of this carnage. Braden knew May was wrong. He couldn't feel her. No. She's not in the building. She's gone. And with that, he collapsed.
Chapter 16. The sound of a branch snapping made Dakotah flinch. Dakotah was hiding in a large hollowed-out area in a huge tree, with bushes to serve as camouflage. She had been here for what seemed like forever, holding little Larson. When she'd first settled herself and the baby into their hiding place, he had begun to cry. Hunger, she surmised, and nursed him quickly. He had now fallen into a sleep, his face innocent and uncomprehending of the danger they'd been in. The sound of the branches snapping came once more. Dakotah trembled. She tried not to squeeze little Larson too tightly, for fear of making him cry out. Something was approaching. Or someone. Chad. And he would take Larson from her. Tears of anger burned in her eyes, the tiny pricks of pain like having minuscule drops of acid behind her lids. She squeezed them shut and tried to keep her breathing quiet. Who am I kidding? He's a shifter. He will be able to hear me. Dakotah. She paused. It took a moment for the thought to process. That was not Chad's voice. Another second and she recognized Doc's voice. It had to be Doc, right? An irrational fear made her think that maybe it was Chad, and he had somehow disguised his voice, making himself sound like Doc. Don't be silly, she chastised herself. Dakotah. Doc's voice again. He's dead. You're safe. For a split second, Dakotah's heart sunk, as she first thought he meant Braden. Of course he didn't, he was speaking of Chad. We're here, Doc. Was that her own voice sounding so small? The sound of bushes shaking heralded the visage of Doc's handsome face, reassuring and strong, blocking the forest light. Chad's? She almost couldn't bring herself to speak it out loud, to believe it. He's dead? Doc nodded. He held out his hands for her to hand him Larson, so she could crawl out of the area. Taking the baby, he scanned it quickly to make sure it was okay while she slipped out of the hiding place. And everyone else? How are they? She held her breath, unsure if she was ready to receive bad news. Griz was hurt, Braden too. She gasped. But they're okay, right? They should be. Chapter 17. Dakotah stepped into May and Doc's home, which until yesterday had looked like a normal home, that now looked like a war zone. It seemed as if every shapeshifter in Bear Canyon Valley had been called in. So many people. She held onto baby Larson, not sure if she was making him feel more secure or herself. At least, she no longer felt the fear she felt around the shapeshifters before. Just as it was with people, there were good shifters and there were bad ones. May ran forward. How are you? Her eyes scanned Dakotah, and then the baby as if looking to find if either had been harmed. Where were you? We were so worried. Dakotah let out a breath, slow and ragged. I had to take the baby and go. I couldn't let Chad get him. I just couldn't. May nodded. Doc told you the danger is past? Dakotah wasn't sure she would ever believe any of the dangers that shifters seemed to live with would ever truly pass. And now her life's mission was to make sure Larson wasn't put in the path of danger. Braden? She hesitated, not sure how much to give away of the emotions swirling within her like a whirlpool. More like a tornado. He is okay. He's in his bear form in the back, May said. She put a hand on Dakotah's arm. I know you've had a rough time with shifters, but would you want to see him? He's not conscious. Dakotah gasped. Not conscious? How badly was he hurt? We didn't know at first. He didn't say anything until he collapsed. And then his bear took over, shifting so he could heal. He lost a lot of blood. I would like to see him. Braden was in a large room that could have doubled for something in a large animal vet clinic. He was on a pallet, the same large polar bear she'd seen the time she'd shot him. Dakotah sat on the pallet next to him, her arm against his mighty shoulder. She didn't fear him at all. The emotions she felt, though, she didn't want to put a name to. She studied his majestic bear profile and dug her fingers into his luxurious fur. Then she looked at Larson. When will you shift, little man? What will you look like? And what about this elemental thing? How will you manage? She sighed. How in the world will I manage? You'll find a way. She flinched at the sound of the unexpected voice. Griz. I thought I was alone. I came to check on you. And my godson. He gazed down at Larson with fondness in his eyes. Thank you, she said. You saved his life. More than once. It's my life's mission, my passion even, to care for other shifters. Dakotah smiled. Just how many godsons do you have, Griz? Officially. His dark eyes twinkled. Just one. He placed one large palm on Larson's forehead. But I have 3 nephews, and more unofficial charges than I could count on both hands. Dakotah didn't find that hard to believe. Not at all. It was easy to see from this man's demeanor that he did have a passion for protection. Dakotah, I'd like to provide you with an option. His expression was serious. What kind? She should probably feel nervous, but she didn't. There was something about Griz that instilled trust within her. A place to stay. A place where Larson can grow up safe. A place where you can live without fear. He moved his hand from Larson's forehead to her shoulder. Girl, I'd say you're due for a little bit of happiness. Bear Canyon Valley can bring you some of that. And the mountain ranges that surround it are my territory. They have been a long time. I can teach Larson everything he needs to know about being a shifter. Griz glanced at Braden. Then he looked back at Dakotah. Unless you find someone who can do that instead of me. Oh no, Mr. Griz. You're not getting out of that so easily. She smiled at him. As his godfather, you will have some very definite responsibilities. This time she put her hand on his shoulder and looked deeply into his eyes. And you will instill in him values I know he will carry with him the rest of his life. I don't think it was an accident you were where you were, or an accident you have become his godfather. Griz looked down. And she could have sworn, for just a moment, there seemed to be glistening in his eyes. He rose to his feet. I'll let you get some rest. I'll see if we can send one of the boys to get something for you to eat. My grizzly heard your stomach rumbling. She laughed. I'm pretty sure they heard it in the next county. Dakotah woke with a start. She'd been sleeping quite heavily. The warmth of Braden's polar bear was lulling. And it probably had something to do with the big meal May had brought in. After Larson had nursed and gone to sleep, avoiding rest had proved impossible as Dakotah's eyelids became heavier and heavier. She moved position slightly, as her foot had fallen asleep. And then she noticed her arms felt empty. A familiar weight was missing. Larson. She pushed her panic away. Maybe May had taken him, perhaps to change his diaper. Or maybe Doc had removed him from her arms, to make sure he was still healthy and well. Panic came back as she realized the blanket Larson had been wrapped in was wadded and still in her lap. That couldn't be. A mewling sound, low and barely audible, caught her attention. She turned her head and glanced at Braden's bear. Dakotah gasped. A tawny bundle of fur, practically rolled into a ball, was curled against Braden's bear. The bear had rolled onto his side, one large paw on the tiny furball. Oh Jesus! Was that her baby? Would that polar bear kill him if he woke up? Panic surged anew. Larson? Dakotah's word was just a whisper, not wanting to wake the bear, fearing for her baby's life. If that was her baby. The tiny furry head, tiny when compared to the bear's head, rose and the little cub's eyes opened. Dakotah stared in those eyes and saw the recognition and saw her baby. How did you do that? She clamped her hand over her mouth. She hadn't meant to speak aloud. The bear moved slightly, its muscles seeming to tense, rippling with the movement. Dakotah froze. Should she be fearful? Braden had risked his life to protect her and Larson. But this was not Braden, she reminded herself. This was his bear. Larson opened his little baby lion mouth with a wide yawn. Dakotah tensed as he ended his yawn with the sleepy sound that she feared would wake the bear. She was not willing to take any chances. She was not willing to leave her baby in that large polar bear's grasp. Dakotah stood slowly, putting her weight on one foot at a time, praying she would not make a sound. She leaned down to where the bear and the baby cub rested, and put her hand out for her son. Except it seemed that Larson's lion cub had other ideas. He turned his head away from her, and tilted his way deeper into Braden's polar bear's arms. Damn. Now what? He's fine. Griz's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Please help my baby. She grabbed his arm and jerked on it. Braden would never hurt Larson. She knew that. But still. Griz held up a hand. I won't let anything happen. But as sure as I would give my life to protect him, I know Braden would do the same. I know his bear would too. His bear has found what he has been looking for. He looked at her intently, as if she should know what this meant. She watched little Larson, adorable in his lion form, looking as if he felt perfectly at home and safe in the arms of that massive bear. She didn't understand this. Then again, she didn't exactly understand her feelings for Braden either. Dakotah dropped to her knees, willing to wait until Larson crawled out or the bear awoke.
Chapter 18. Braden was still in the grip of his bear's control, but he was not unaware that his bear was at peace. And in that peace, Braden was able to rest and let his body heal. He had taken quite a hit, a major artery in his thigh. He had bled a lot, and hadn't realized himself how much until he felt himself fall. He was still groggy, but slowly coming to. In that state of half asleep, half awake, he heard several heartbeats. He scented different smells. One was Dakotah. The other was Griz. The third was a lion. His polar bear eyes flew open. A lion? Could this be the lion that had attacked him? The one they had killed? Movement against his chest made him look down. A lion cub, small compared to his own size, was shuffling and kneading at his fur. The answer was immediate. Larson. Braden wrapped his paws around the little lion and made him comfortable. He studied his tiny features, the little spots that would have provided camouflage if he'd been born in the wild, the tawny tufts on his ears. Cuteness personified. He couldn't resist the smile that crept to his face. Then, he had this feeling of being watched. Braden glanced up to find Dakotah watching them, a scared expression on her face that was fading away. He shifted into his human form. Hopefully, she realized he wasn't a threat. Hey. He kept his voice low, not wanting to wake Larson. Hi, Dakotah said. She chewed her bottom lip in a way that not only made her adorable, but left him with a furious desire to kiss her. Okay, maybe a whole hell of a lot more than kiss. He looks like he feels at home here, doesn't he? Braden hoped she would agree with him. Her chewing became more intense. Finally, she said, I hate to admit it, but I think he does. Just when Braden wanted to talk to her, to tell her so much, Griz walked in. You're awake. Braden nodded. Then Griz said, You don't look too bad. A half smile came to his face. Seems my godson is making himself at home, isn't he? Just that moment, Larson's lion cub glanced up at Braden, then across at his mother, and then shifted into a baby. A second later, his mouth was open and wailing. My cue to exit. Griz laughed. Time for the handoff. Braden indicated for Dakotah to take the crying baby. She was already reaching across. Sorry, she said with a smile. I'm guessing you like him better as a lion. Larson was already quieting. Braden caught her fingers with his, trapping them for a second. I like him any way he is. Same with his mama. A blush bloomed on Dakotah's cheeks, and she released a scent that told him she very much enjoyed what he said. And then she put a stern look on her face. I'm not into casual flirtation. Do I seem like the casual type? He asked. His tone was serious. She shook her head. The red color fading. Good. No flirtation here. He locked gazes with her, hoping she got it. He didn't want her to underestimate the message he was sending. A soft knock on the door's jam, then Sierra peeked her head in. Griz said you were awake. Grand Central Station, Braden thought, but didn't say. Yeah, I'm up. Too bad he couldn't have a single moment alone with Dakotah. There seemed to be so much he wanted to say. What's on your mind? He asked Sierra. She glanced between the two of them, clearly using her intuitive skills to assess the scenario, then spoke. I was thinking maybe you would want to do something about. She glanced at Dakotah as if wondering if she could mention this in front of her. It's okay, Braden assured her. I was thinking maybe you would want to do something about your scars. Like what? She had his curiosity piqued. He'd never thought there could be something done about the nightmare he lived in. Well, I was talking to Griz and Doc. I think I know what my brother did. The original shot put your bear under, so my brother's dastardly act could work. He attached a hex, for lack of a better term, and it's making your bear relive your torment. Braden frowned at the complexity of this. Sounds more like witchcraft. He was definitely not a fan of sorcery, had never really been a fan of witches until meeting the Romanovs and some of their friends. I suppose it is sort of like witchcraft, Sierra said. Do you know my brother? Why would he do this to you? I don't know him and never met him before. But I'll never forget eyes like his. I heard he works for hire. Can you think of any enemies that you might have? Enemies? Don't all shifters have enemies? He shrugged. There was another polar bear shifter in Sigma Epsilon. I was in Gamma Psi. That polar bear shifter is dead, killed by Gavin Castro. Sierra tilted her head. Gavin, as in Mr. Mikhail Romanov's daughter's mate? Yeah, a Butter Bar second lieutenant officer who got most of Gavin's unit killed. Gavin's brother was one of them. Excuse me, Larson's hungry, Dakotah said, and slipped out the door. Braden and his bear both noted her absence immediately. It was as if his world had a void the size of a continent in it now. Man, I got it bad. His bear had it pretty damn bad too. Yeah, he does. Braden. Sierra pulled him from his reverie. Sorry. What? Sierra shook her head at him, a mystical smile on her face. Shifters and their fated mates. What? No. Don't bother. Sierra shook her head. It's not exactly a secret. You shifters, your love, the way you bond, the foreverness of it, the intensity of it, it's no secret to other paranormal beings, you know. He cocked his head. Intuitives aren't the same. Others aren't like this. You don't feel this kind of love? Oh, I didn't say that. Sierra had a look on her face that for a brief moment he wanted to identify as melancholy, but then quickly she covered it. We feel. He raised a brow. That was all she was going to say. He found that hard to believe, especially when he'd just read an emotion on a face that was practiced to contain emotions. Intuitives were renowned for their skills with hiding their emotions and detecting emotions in others. Shall we work on your problem? Sierra was definitely ready to change topics. You mean the one your brother gave me? Her already light skin paled, and she let out a sigh, dropping down to the pallet next to him. Sorry, he said. And he was sorry. It wasn't her fault that her brother was a douchebag who'd hexed him into a state of insomnia and agony. But still, he was human, his bear roared, okay, part human, and it was hard not to be angry at the world at times. You really think you can help me? She can. Griz walked in. Damn, this place really was Grand Central. Sierra gave Griz a look. I believe I can. Braden frowned. That sounds dubious. I've never done this before. I watched my grandmother's sister. Even helped her a couple of times. So what's this procedure? Pretty much like an exorcism. Griz grinned. What the? Braden did a double take between the two of them, his gaze bouncing like a ping pong. Sierra groaned. No. Don't listen to him. She hit Griz on the shoulder. Why do you do that? Well, what else would you compare it to? Griz protested, his smile reduced to a grin. I wouldn't call it that. There aren't any demons in him. Then what would you call what's in him? Time for you to go. Sierra rose to her feet and not so gently urged Griz out of the room. Your bedside manner stinks. So what's the deal? Braden asked her. Don't sugarcoat it. If it's not an exorcism, then what is it? He's put an essence in to haunt your bear. Braden shuddered, bothered by the thought of that. Sounds like a damned exorcism to me. It's not a demon. It's not even alive. It's something that haunts your bear. Do you have any idea what you're minimizing? You don't, do you? You don't know the torment. You have no clue. Her face saddened. I do. I have a very definite clue. How's that? Braden barked, irritated by the idea she didn't understand how dire this was, how he'd reached a point where he didn't want to live. Her voice choked, and still standing from shooing Griz out of the room, she turned to face the wall, fiddling with jars on a shelf, rearranging them over and over again before she finally cleared her throat. Her shoulders were stiff as she began to talk. My fiancé. She shook her head, then turned to face him. Her lighter-than-light eyes were surrounded by red shot whites. My brother did that to my fiancé Wharton, when he found out I was going to take a shifter as my mate. Wharton's tiger killed Wharton trying to get out of his body and away from the hexed essence my brother put in him. She was clenching and unclenching her fists. Braden rose, put an arm on her shoulder. I'm sorry. You had no way of knowing. But you see, it means a lot to me to make this work. I have to make it work. If it worked, he'd be free. He felt like he'd been giving a reprieve from death row. A sound from the doorway made Braden snap his head in that direction. Dakotah stood there, her hand over her mouth. It must have been what he heard. She was taking in the scene, her eyes full of concern. What are the dangers? Dakotah asked.
Chapter 19. A pinch of jealousy shot through Dakotah. She didn't think for a second there was anything going on between Braden and Sierra, but that didn't stop the intensity of the feeling that traveled through her. The next emotion that coursed within her veins was fear as she processed what she'd just heard. Whatever it was, this essence hex thing, it could kill Braden the way it had killed Sierra's fiancé. No. Hell to the no. Dakotah wasn't willing to stand by and watch that happen to Braden. She didn't know if he'd ever share the same feelings for her that she had for him, but she'd be damned if she'd watch this amazing man die. And I'll find Sierra's brother and fucking kill him with my bare hands if Braden dies. I swear this. Braden walked away from Sierra and approached her. This isn't what she put her hand up. His explanation was secondary to her concern about his well-being. She looked at Sierra. What are the dangers? Griz stepped into the room. May said to tell you Larson's asleep. Thank you. Doc followed Griz into the room. I'm here to help, if there's anything I can do. When do you want to do this? Braden asked, as if suddenly in a hurry to get this over with. It's up to you, Sierra said. Now okay. His voice was anxious. Dakotah noted he definitely couldn't wait anymore and wondered why. Maybe he had someone special back home. Someone waiting for him to return. Is that all right with everyone else? Sierra looked around the room. Sure, Griz said. Absolutely, Doc agreed. Braden looked at Dakotah. I still haven't heard what the dangers are. Dakotah felt awkward saying that, knowing maybe he had someone else, but it didn't matter. She cared. She wanted to know. Sierra opened her mouth to answer, but Braden shook his head. It doesn't matter what the dangers are. You have to understand the danger if we don't do this. He stumbled around the words as if stumped what to call it. Dakotah was happy he wasn't using the word exorcism. Procedure, Sierra finished for him. Thanks. Procedure. He motioned for Dakotah to come closer. You don't understand. Let's give them a moment, Doc said and slipped out. Everyone else followed Doc out of the room. Dakotah stepped closer to Braden. He took her hand in his. If I come through this okay, there's stuff we need to talk about. But? There's no buts. You don't understand. This thing that's going on. It's about driven me to the point where I didn't want to live. I don't want it to take me there again, if it gets as bad. I need to have something to look forward to. Look forward to? Yeah. Then he raised his voice. Let's get the show on the road. Dakotah was perplexed by how distant he seemed at this moment. Maybe it's not distant. Maybe he's just so focused on this goal. She kept her voice low. Mind if I'm in here? She paused, uncertain how to proceed, sorting her thoughts before continuing. I mean during the procedure. I wouldn't want you anywhere else. His voice was a soft growl. She recognized the shifter in him, and found that not only was there no bitterness in her for the shifter, she'd come to accept this about him. And all the others. All because of that little lion cub shifter the sun rose on and set on for her. Larson was her everything. Thank God he doesn't have this thing. Then the earlier conversation struck home again. Larson had that elemental thing. She needed to know more about that. She needed to learn how to protect her baby from that. How to help her son live to adulthood. She released a breath. Braden must have misunderstood why she sighed, for he reached out and took her hand. It will be okay. I can only hope. She smiled and hoped her smile looked genuine. What do you need for this? Dakotah had visions of herbs, potion bottles, candles. Or maybe it was more like scalpels and surgical lights and scrubs. My bag has a couple of things. I'll get it. Doc stepped out. Chapter 20. Standing by the bed that Braden was in, Dakotah fought the urge to touch his face. He looked so peaceful. Whatever Sierra had given him to drink had put him into a deep sleep. Maybe he was even unconscious, but Dakotah didn't want to disrupt with questions to find out if that was the case. Sierra was on the other side of Braden, next to his shoulder. She stepped back. Just to be sure, I'd like Doc and Griz to be near his head. Dakotah scooted back as the two men moved into position. She wanted to ask what they were being sure of, and why they needed to be there, but still fought the temptation. Sierra looked at her. Please don't worry. I won't be reckless. First, I'll summon the essence that is plaguing him, uproot it from its setting, strip it of its powers. Then I'll insulate it so it can't attach itself to another shifter animal, and I'll remove it. Sierra stood at the foot of the large bed, raised her hands as if in supplication, and she released a sound that reminded Dakotah of the priestesses she'd seen in a fantasy movie. A chanting sound erupted, filling the room with ethereal magic. Sierra's eyes glowed as she recited, Hear my plea, essence from beyond, I summon thee to flee your abode. Cross the veil, perish without. More chanting and more repeating of words, but slowly the words merged into a language Dakotah didn't understand. Sierra's voice had begun to lull Dakotah into a mesmerizing spell, when a yell interrupted the serenity. The blood-curdling sound came from Braden, whose eyes were still closed. He began to thrash about, tossing in the bed, his head striking the massive carved wood headboard. He's convulsing. Doc's voice was measured and calm, but underlying with concern. Need to hold him down before he hurts himself. I got this side. Griz grabbed Braden's shoulder. Got this shoulder. Doc held Braden down. Dakotah clenched her fists together to keep from pouncing toward Braden to help. She'd do no good now. Unsure what to do, how to react, she looked at Sierra, watched her to see if there was any panic in her face. Sierra gave her a smile. Not to worry. This is expected. Expected? How the hell was this expected? Braden's body was thrashing against the mattress, coming down hard, making the bed rock and the bed's feet grind against the wood floor. Dakotah took a step forward. Rethinking the matter, and not wanting to get in the way, she took a step back. Sierra waved her forward. Go closer to him. Talk to him. Dakotah felt awkward. What could she say? In front of Doc and Griz, no less. She stepped near the bed and took Braden's hand in hers. His fingers were clenching and unclenching into fists. Holding his hand, she bit back the cry of pain when he squeezed hers during one of his clenching moments. She released her fingers when his grip loosened and took his large hand in hers, holding it, rubbing it. She laid her forehead on his forearm, closed her eyes. Pretty soon, she was lost in her memories, had tuned everything out except Braden and herself. She talked to him, muttering. It seemed she talked forever, and about things she'd never shared with anyone. Things about her family, about being alone, about Deep Hollow. About the baby. How she hadn't wanted him at first, hadn't wanted anything that came from those horrible shapeshifters who'd tormented her and used her body like a petri dish to grow something. Then how she'd come to love and accept that he was her son, her baby, and that she'd give her life for him. She told Braden about her dreams for Larson. Her fears for him. How she didn't want the elemental thing in him, whatever that was, to kill the shifter in him, because that might kill Larson too. How she wanted her baby to be happy and healthy, and she wanted him to have the life she never had. When she finally stopped talking, she realized she had dried tears on her face and the room had begun to darken. She and Braden were alone. He was sleeping heavily, his chest broad and muscled rose with each breath. Had she fallen asleep? Where had everyone gone? Was Braden okay? She stirred slightly, then sat up. Somehow she'd wound up half on and half on the bed. Where are you going? Braden's voice was thick with sleep. You're awake. She almost laughed at herself for stating the obvious. She felt nervous. Why? Maybe because I told him everything about myself. Something she rarely did, sharing herself. Yeah. He stretched slightly, then frowned. His expression gave her pause. Concerned, she asked, How do you feel? Like I slept. She raised a brow. Interesting answer. Considering I don't know the last time I got rest. That must have been rough. She touched his hand. Her fingertips sizzled with the contact, starting where their skin met and traveling throughout her body. Dakotah looked down, scared he'd see an emotion in her face, unsure if she could even deal with this emotion herself yet. Braden raised his hand, tipped her head up and locked gazes with her. No more running. Not me. Not you. She held his eyes, unsure if she was being held captive by his stare or the conversation. No more running, she repeated, her voice low. She thought that phrase over, testing it in her head. Could it be that the running could come to an end? That moment, with perfectly imperfect timing, Sierra walked into the room. Dakotah stepped away from the bed, feeling like an awkward teenager caught in the middle of something she shouldn't have been doing. For Pete's sake, I'm an adult. What's wrong with me? How are you? Sierra approached Braden. How do your scars feel? Scars? Braden paused. This is the first time I haven't been aware of them. He pushed his sleeve aside. The scars had become more faded than Dakotah had ever seen them. Just then she noticed Griz at the doorway beckoning her. I'll be back in a few. She wondered if Larson needed her. Had she been out that long? Griz took her by the hand, drawing her away from the door toward the kitchen. Is Larson okay? He's fine. Still sleeping. May's watching over him like a hawk. Won't leave his side. Gratitude flooded throughout Dakotah. I'll have to thank her. She glanced at Griz. What's up? Her curiosity was piqued. Just wanted to check on you. That exorcism was meant for Braden, but it seemed you let loose a few demons of your own. Oh, that stuff at Deep Hollow. She followed him onto the back porch and sat next to him on the swing. The mountains were in all their glory, varying colors of green topped with a light sprinkling of white. An occasional orange or yellow color imbued the picturesque view. More than Deep Hollow. You mean my feelings for Larson? No. Don't you remember? He gave her a look. You talked about your family. The foster homes. Running away. Heat kissed her cheeks. She never discussed her childhood. Never. What the hell had possessed her? I'm sorry. Griz put his hand on her arm, the large palm warm and comforting. Look it. You don't ever have to apologize for that sort of thing. Not in this valley, not in these mountains. That did it. Every emotion Dakotah had kept under control from the time she was left alone in the world to fend for herself since she was 12. Every single emotion came pouring out in the form of hot tears. She kept her head turned toward the mountain, those silent tears only witnessed by the majestic pines that overlooked the porch. Quietly she sat, releasing those tears as she clearly set free the demons plaguing her from a young age. When the tears had gone, with Griz still silent by her side, she turned to face him. I've never had a place like this. This is home now, Griz said. His eyes held the answers and the secrets of ages. It's your home. We're your family. Don't you dare make me cry again, Dakotah threatened him. Griz put his arm around her, pulled her head to his shoulder. Cry all you want. Just stop holding everything back. It's not good for you. Especially those feelings you have for that man in there. I can't have feelings for him. I can't. I need to be there for Larson. What of Larson's needs? Griz asked her. Dakotah pulled away, studied his face, the scar she wanted to ask about but didn't want to be rude. What do you mean? Your son has needs. Just then the door opened. Doc poked his head out. Braden's asking about you. Wondered if you're okay. Dakotah rushed inside past Griz, Doc, and almost ran into Sierra as she was leaving the room Braden was in. Braden was sitting on the side of the bed, looking better than she'd ever seen him look. That wasn't fair. It made her heart hurt with the idea that she'd lose this man from her life. She was thinking she agreed with Griz that Bear Canyon Valley would be the best place for Larson. And of course, she knew Braden would be going back to wherever he planned to go. And be with whomever he wants. That thought bothered her. Hey. How are you? She asked to avoid feeling and thinking about his leaving. He studied her, his gaze never leaving her face. Why were you crying? She hesitated. How could she ever begin to get into that? Long story. His eyes narrowed. Griz made you cry? No. Not at all. A part of her was thrilled he would jump to her protection. Another part was sad, because he wouldn't be there to do that long term. As much as she liked what he said about not running, he didn't understand. She had a child to raise. Larson was her priority. So you're doing much better. And are you in the clear? Sierra said it was a success. He raised his shirt. See? Barely any scars. Dakotah held her breath at the sight of his abs, his chest, that expanse of skin she'd have given anything to touch with her hands, lips, tongue. She gulped. I see. The scars do look better. She plucked at the bedsheets. I guess you'll be going home soon. I have plans. Of course, how stupid of her. He had to have plans. Never mind. She didn't want to hear about it. Maybe one day, when she didn't care as much, it'd be easier. I need to check on Larson. Anything to get away from the feelings that became stronger for this man every second she was around him. Wait, Braden said. She turned his way, eyes cast down. She needed to keep Larson in mind and not concern herself with a man. Looking at him would only lessen her resolve. She heard him rise to his feet. The bed's mattress creaking to announcing it. The floor creaked, letting her know he was approaching. His hand took hers and still she kept her eyes down but watched their intertwined fingers, the way his overlapped and held hers. So natural. So right. I can grill a steak like you wouldn't believe. That made her look up. What? Had Sierra's procedure confused him? You're not gonna feed salad to that little carnivore, are you? He had a half smile on his lips. She stared at him, confused. I'm a hell of a teacher. Baseball. Hockey. Football. Rugby. Not to mention my shifter skills. She was getting more confused by the second. What do you mean? I'm not going back to New York. Then, I'll need something to do. Let me teach little Elle the shifter ropes. I can't pay you. Couldn't even support herself and Larson. A voice boomed from the doorway. You two can't figure jack shit out, can you? Griz walked in, carrying Larson. Good thing I'm here for my godson. He handed the baby to Dakotah. Here's the damn plan. He patted the top of Larson's head. Sorry about the language. Plan? Did he say plan? Chapter 21. Dakotah and Larson had been staying with Griz for several days now. Griz's cabin sat high in the Bear Canyon mountain range. His log home, rustic on the outside, but large and completely updated on the inside, overlooked the valley. From the large windows in the bedroom she and Larson shared, Dakotah could see May's house, Doc's clinic, and the bed and breakfast May owned. If she stood at a different angle, at the far end of the window, she could see Astra and Kane's cabin tucked into the evergreens, practically hidden if one didn't know where to look. Dakotah and Larson weren't the only houseguests that Griz had. Braden was staying here too. Oh yes, indeed, Griz definitely had a plan. His plan had been to have the three of them as houseguests, perhaps even long-term houseguests, judging from the way he was behaving. Dakotah couldn't say she minded. Her days were spent caring for Larson, changing his diapers, feeding him, getting to know and enjoy her baby and his lion shifter cub self, while Griz and Braden were gone, helping Tanner and Teague with some construction project. This was the first time she'd ever felt safe. The first time since both of her parents died. She needed to talk to someone about a job. She couldn't live off of Griz forever. She had never felt comfortable mooching, and she wasn't about to start. She just needed to find the right time to talk to him, hopefully alone. Unfortunately, Braden was always there. Not that she minded Braden be there. In fact, truth be told, she'd gotten a little bit too used to his presence. He hadn't said anything about leaving or going back home, but he also hadn't said anything else about all those things he said the day Sierra helped him. Today was a beautiful Saturday morning, which hopefully meant the guys didn't have to work. It would be nice to have company, after 5 days straight of having the home to herself from dawn until well after dark. She heard a mewling sound and turned to check on Larson, who should still be sleeping in his crib, a large wooden contraption that was bigger than the average crib, and definitely not new judging from the weathered slats. Griz had told her it had been in his family for several generations. She could tell from the scratch and bite marks that it had housed more than average babies. Definitely shifter babies. She'd noticed a couple of times when Larson had shifted into his cub and chewed on the round slats. In his lion cub shifter form, Larson watched her intently. Dakotah smiled at her baby. You're up early. Larson released a soft growl and tossed his head playfully. He jumped on his hind legs and put his front paws on the horizontal bar of the crib. Okay. I'm coming. But if you need to nurse, you better know you're not to do it like that. I need you to turn into your boy body. Griz had told her that Larson was inexplicably advanced for his age. That he shouldn't be able to shift so easily so early in life. May had explained it had something to do with this elemental. And every time Dakotah was reminded of his elemental, that vein of fear laced itself around her heart. That damned elemental. It could kill his shifter animal. Okay, little man, let's get you fed. She reached into the crib, ran her hands over the cub's head where one day a mighty mane would be. As her fingers ran through the fur, her cub child lowered himself to all fours, then lay on his side. His head turned into a baby's head, no longer furry but rather covered with downy hair. Larson gurgled up at her. Tiny drops struck the top of her head and shoulders. No, baby. Don't do that. Don't make it rain on Mama. He gurgled some more, slight baby laughter, and then stopped the rain. You're so very bad, she said in a low tone, clearly teasing him. A soft knock at the door brought her teasing to a halt. Come in. The door opened and Griz appeared. I hope you didn't forget. She looked at him. Oh my gosh. I had forgotten. Griz had told her he had plans for her and Larson today. How could she have forgotten? We'll be ready in less than 10. There's not a big rush. Just something I want to show you. See if maybe you're interested. He closed the door and left her and Larson to get ready. Now that was mysterious. Braden and Griz were both in the kitchen when Dakotah walked in carrying Larson. She froze the minute she laid eyes on Braden. His gaze locked with hers. She fumbled with the fabric of Larson's pants, unsure what else to do with her nervous fingers. You would think that the effect that Braden had on her would diminish over the days, but no, every time she saw him it was stronger than the time before. It left her a quivering, jumbled mess inside. She barely managed to croak out a good morning with the way her throat locked up. Braden's eyes traveled the length of her. Oh God, he's killing me. So what's the plan? Braden blew on the coffee in his cup. Just want to show you two something. Even more mysterious. And then Griz added, might have an offer to make. Dakotah shook her head. You're good at that suspense thing, aren't you? Chapter 22. With Griz taking the lead, Dakotah followed, carrying Larson in a front carrier sling attached to her body, and Braden brought up the rear. Truth be told, it was not a bad job. He glanced at Dakotah's swaying hips and tempting ass. Damn, not a bad job at all. Griz had taken them a short distance from his cabin. Braden wasn't exactly unfamiliar with the area, since he and Griz had been working out here with Tanner and Teague building a cabin. But he'd never been this way. And he was surprised when Griz showed them the entrance to a cave that he'd never noticed before. Dakotah appraised the cave's opening. You want to go in there? Incredulity and an amount of fear were evident in her tone. There's nothing to be concerned about, Griz said. Larson laughed as though to punctuate Griz's statement. What's in there? Dakotah wouldn't let the matter go. She was clearly not willing to walk in without more information. Griz reached into a pack. He pulled out a lantern. This is for you, Dakotah. Shifters don't need it. Show off. Dakotah stuck her tongue out at him. Griz laughed out loud. The sound bounced back from the cave. Larson squirmed and giggled at the sound of Griz's laughter being echoed. I'll protect you, Braden said, putting his arm around Dakotah's shoulders. That electricity struck him where his skin contacted hers. He couldn't prevent the shiver that coursed up his spine. Nor could he have prevented the roar his bear released in his head, clearly wanting their mate. She's not our mate, he reminded his bear. His bear roared in return. Griz was watching him. He nodded. Ready? Dakotah's nod was not enthusiastic. But Larson made up with that in giggling. When we get inside the cave, well into it, you may want to let him down, Griz indicated Larson. He will probably want to shift and explore. Will it be safe? Dakotah wore a frown. One of the safest places on Earth. So where does this cave lead? Braden asked after they'd walked 20 minutes. I'll show you just around this corner, Griz said. Sure enough, around that corner there was a sitting area. Stone benches and a stone picnic table in a room surrounded by cave walls. Griz held the lantern up so Dakotah could get a view. Wow. Dakotah took the lantern from him and walked around the edges of the room. What's all this writing on the walls? It's a long story. I'm not in a hurry, Braden said. He turned to Dakotah. Are you? Dakotah shook her head. Not one bit. She let out a little squeal, which echoed off the walls. You weren't kidding. She released Larson from the sling as he was shifting into a cub. I figured he'd want to check the place out. Griz smiled. Most of the young shifters want to. They can sense it. Sense what? That this is a place of importance to shifters. What do you mean? Braden looked around the place. All he could see was a big cavern with several offshoot tunnels. This place was where our people hid and lived when they were persecuted long ago. It connects to the tunnels that Grant's grandfather's people added. It could house a town. He pointed toward one tunnel. That one leads to a storage area. I'll show you as soon as we've had lunch. He pointed to another one. That one leads to, well, that's a surprise. I'll show you. It's best seen not heard about anyway. Belly full of fried chicken, Braden followed Griz and Dakotah, while Larson in his lion cub body scampered about amongst them, occasionally finding a bug to chase. Once making for a mouse, which of course made Dakotah squeal, first with surprise then fear. He's a lion, Braden told her. He's not afraid of a little ol' mouse. Right? Her answer was sarcastic. That's not what I hear. I wouldn't know, Braden countered. I'm a bear. The glance she gave him when she looked over her shoulder made his breath catch. God, he wanted this woman. Forever. And then some. I better do something about this. His bear roared in agreement. Like what, Braden wondered. There was really only one thing he wanted to do. After a few moments of walking along the surprise tunnel, Griz pointed toward the end. See? A sight Braden wouldn't have believed beheld him. You're one of those preppers types, he accused Griz with a smile. Before them stood shelves and shelves of food, supplies, an unbelievable amount of food. You could feed an army, Dakotah said with wonder. That's the point if it needs to be. Griz grinned. Last time we were caught less than fully prepared. What do you anticipate could happen? The Cold War's over, isn't it? Braden studied the scene before them. This has been used recently. We had a couple of brothers being sought after by some unsavory types. Gave them a place to stay, and with everything in here already, no one's eyebrows were raised about anyone buying extra groceries, clothing, supplies. I hope it turned out okay. Dakotah said. For the brothers, I mean. It did. They're back home. They're safe. Griz started out the room, clearly done expanding on the matter. He sure as hell can keep a secret. Just the kind of friend a guy could use. There's something I think you guys will enjoy. You go this way, he pointed toward his left. Braden nodded. Sure. I'm game, Dakotah said. Larson yipped a tiny sound of joy. Dakotah knelt and hugged the cub, planting a kiss on his furry head. You're going to be a handful one day, aren't you? Thunder rolled in the distance, as Larson made a gurgling sound that was a mix between a growl and a purr. Follow that tunnel. Take the first right, the third left, and go all the way to the end. The water is warm if you want to swim. Swim? Dakotah laughed. We didn't bring suits. Good point. Well, there's some stuff there if you want. Towels. Maybe even some swimwear at the back, in some plastic containers. You'll see the shelves when you get there. Braden had a question. Aren't you going? Nah, Griz strode out of the area toward the tunnel. He turned back to say, Dakotah, I'd like a bit of time with my godson if you don't mind. Dakotah tilted her head. I'm sure Larson would love it. I've got plenty of formula in the bag, ready to go. She took the backpack Braden had been carrying for her, and handed it to Griz. Enjoy. She joined Braden at the entrance to the next tunnel. Chapter 23. Dakotah carried the lantern high. Granted, Braden may not need it, but she surely did. Times like this, she wondered if it wouldn't have been nice to be a shifter. Except they lived with such danger in their lives. Yeah, like mine was a piece of cake. True, it wasn't. The first thing that hit her senses was the sound. She paused. Hear that? Braden nodded. Water falling, she asked him. As if he can see through caves and tunnel walls to know, she chastised herself. That's my guess, he said, taking her hand and leading her farther down the tunnel toward the water and the direction Griz told them to go. The next thing that struck her was the light at the end of the tunnel. Light? Were they at the end? She was all turned around, but she didn't think they'd come back to the entrance. Unless there are other entrances. She shrugged, supposing there could be. A slight smile seemed to be playing on Braden's lips. What is it? She asked. Not sure yet. He kept his eyes forward. But you have a suspicion. Just an idea. He tugged her hand. Let's find out. And with that, He pulled her into a slow trot toward the brightness. At the end of the tunnel, she froze and beheld the sight before her. My goodness! It was a large chamber, a monstrous-sized cavern with a hole at the top that let sun in to illuminate a waterfall cascading into a lagoon. The water was lustrous and blue, prettier than any vacation brochure she'd ever seen. I can't. She clapped her hands over her mouth. This is unbelievable. And it's here. Right here in the mountains. And it's a secret. Braden stepped behind her, put his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling as if they'd done this a million times before and feeling so much at home. This man was her home. What about Larson? That other voice asked in the deep recesses of her mind. Why can't I have both my men? The voice asked her if that's what she thought Braden would want. Dakotah pushed that aside. So not dealing with negative, not now. For now, she had this moment. With him. Alone. It was the first time she'd truly been alone with him for any length of time. How odd, as much as she'd been around him, it had always been in brief spurts and often joined by others. These days, usually it was Griz, unless it was one of the valley shifters or their mates visiting. Penny for those thoughts. Braden's voice was so close to her ear, his scent so man-earth spice sex. This man personified those qualities. Her chest swelled with the thought of him. And other things began to take a course of their own, namely her attraction to him and its manifestation. She cleared her throat before she lost full control of her senses, and turned around and begged this man to kiss her. Shall we? She stepped away from him toward the scenery below. One side of the lagoon was more like a beach with sand and tiny pebbles. You didn't answer, he reminded her, catching her hand and pulling her toward him, tipping her head back so she would look into his eyes. A silver flame flared in the depths of his eyes. She studied it. Couldn't tear her gaze from it, it was as if. Oh. He cocked a brow, his expression serious. Oh. That. She stared. The silver light was back, coming in and out, brighter, then more dim. She realized what it was. But she'd never seen it, among any of the shifters she'd been around before. That's your bear. She cupped his face with her hands and locked stares, looking deeply within. That's your bear in there. The moment the words left her lips, a sensation coursed through her body as if she'd been held in a warm embrace. Braden nodded. He's been trying to reach out to you for quite a while now. He took her head in his hands the same way she held his. It's just that there were other things to deal with. She nodded. Lots of other stuff. Big stuff. But now we're here, he said. A bout of shyness took over Dakotah, from the intensity of the emotions from his bear, and from deep within her heart. Let's go. You wanted to, right? He shook his head as if puzzled. Yeah, but you still need to tell me about your thoughts. Come on. She yanked him forward. There's a ledge next to the waterfall. Let's check it out.
Chapter 24. Famous last words. Or maybe a better way to say it would be. Words that shouldn't be together. Waterfall. Ledge. Check it out. No sooner than they'd gotten on the steep ridge, Dakotah lost her footing. She flipped into the water, avoiding the stone ledges that stuck out. Not that Braden had much time to notice what all she did, avoid or not, because he didn't even take the time to undress, diving straight in after her, bringing her to the surface. They both emerged from the water, laughter on their lips. So much for my idea to stay out of the water. Dakotah giggled. You could have given me a chance to get out of these clothes. You. She laughed. I'm sinking from the weight of mine. Let's see if we can't do something about that. Braden fingered the first button on her top. She gave him a look. I'm not skinny dipping. Anyone could come up here. So you would if no one came up. Braden teased. You stop. She grabbed the ledge so she didn't go under. The clothing was seriously not working very well. It'd drown her if she didn't hold on. How's the water not ice cold? You have to ask Griz. I'm not an expert on the area or the hot springs that might be here. Do you like working with him? Braden nodded. He's like the brother I never had. Bain's great and we're close, but in his younger years, I didn't get to see him as much. His father was strict about Bain visiting with my sister's side of the family. Nice to have family, isn't it? She fumbled with her own button now. I think I will lose the top. I have a chemise on beneath it. But I'm barely treading water with all these garments pulling me. He dove under, then less than 30 seconds later, came up holding his jeans. What the heck? How'd you do that? A large smile plastered on her face, a blush kissed her cheeks. I'm a ninja. He tossed the jeans to the ledge. I'm a polar bear. We have skills, you know. He dove under again, and unbuttoned her pants, then slid them off. Luckily, she didn't fight him. Coming up for air, he handed her the garment. You're so good at tossing, she started to say. He took it from her, and it joined his jeans on the ledge. Better? Much. Thank you. She handed him her top, with a silky thing still covering her body. But man, that silky piece of fabric clung to her curves in all the right ways. Damn. She was watching him, her expression intense. Concerned, he asked, You okay? She nodded. I am. This is so surreal. You, me, here in this magical place. With magical feelings, he wanted to add, but didn't. Couldn't. He didn't want to scare her off. But this is good, right? It's very good. Her face scrunched up and she turned her head away. Damn. She was crying. Finger on her chin, Braden tipped her face toward him. Tears cascaded down cheeks blotched with pink. The white of her eyes were red from swimming. Her bottom lip trembled and she bit into it. Index finger still on her chin, he placed his thumb on her lip and released it from pearly white punishers. Her eyes remained focused on his face, not straying, not looking away. Hesitation in the dark depths shredded his heart. Dakotah. Her name came out with his breath hushed low and ripped from his very soul. A few short days ago, it felt like weeks really, he'd thought his life not worth living. And now there was Dakotah. And Larson. His bare senses picked up her increasing heart rate. The heat between their bodies, despite the water's coolness, the electric charge where she leaned against him traveled through his torso, making a journey south, where there'd be no mistaking his intent. His cock pulsed painfully. Full breasts pressed against his chest, her nipples hardened peaks. He should release her. He should before his desire and his bear made it too late to let her go. Braden wanted to push his conscience away. Or maybe his bear could push his scruples away. He wanted Dakotah way too much. His love for her was way too deep. He hissed his need to be one with her, and buried his fingers in her dark hair, pulling her head back, baring sweet lips. A small gasp slipped from Dakotah. Her breath warm on his own approaching lips. He lowered his head until his lips rested on hers. He pulled her closer, his thighs melding to hers, his hardness pressed against her body. Braden closed his eyes, sinking into the sensation of having his mate next to him finally.
Chapter 25. Dakotah was unable to push away the yearning that Braden created in her. At the apex of her legs, her body throbbed and her muscles flexed in response to his presence. The passion between them made her pulse race and her heart drum a beat that drowned out all other sound. His tongue took her captive. His mouth claimed her mouth, heart, and soul. Her inner thighs taut, Dakotah tipped her head farther back as his tongue explored and conquered. A shudder ran through her. His hand ran up her side, from her hip to just below her breast. Holding her breath with anticipation, her lungs swelled to bursting from the built-up pressure. His hand traveled higher over her soaking bra, found her nipple, hard and peeking for him. She shook as his forefinger and thumb rolled the dusky tip, making her ache for his mouth to be where his fingers were. His bulging length pressed against her mound, his hand on her breast, his mouth on hers, it was too much. Dakotah moaned, a sound she couldn't have controlled if she'd wanted to. She sought the bottom of his shirt, and slipped her fingers beneath, running hands over a set of abs that rippled as her fingers walked over his flesh and headed north. His chest was solid muscle. Braden was sheer excellence. All man. All shifter. All hers, at least for this moment. "Do you know what your touch does to me?" he said. Lust-filled eyes closed their lids halfway. Bedroom eyes. God. She knew what she did to him. She knew because he made her feel the same way. He pulled her toward the waterfall at the other end. She laughed, but it was a giddy sound, one of anticipation and desire. When they reached the solid rock next to the cascading water, he pushed her against the hard surface and placed his finger under the strap of her bra, tugging gently. "I want you." He pulled the strap out, as if wanting her to be sure. God, was she ever sure? She put her hand on his hip, then lowered it. God, was she going to be bold? Her fingers slipped around his hardness, skimming over the mushroom head while she wrapped them around his girth. His breath caught with a low whoosh. Braden put his hand over hers, pressing her hand, driving his length against her palm, grinding against her. She squeezed him, moving her hand up and down, her movements constricted by his grip on her hand. "I need you." His voice was a melding of torture and ecstasy. Every bit of her desired his touch. "Please?" "Dakotah." His sex-husky tone made shivers run up her spine despite the warmth of his body. "I want you to." "Are you sure?" She bit her lip and gave him a nod. Braden. His name slid off her lips as if she'd never stopped saying it. It was as much hers as it was his. He lowered his head and touched his lips to hers, groaning into their melded mouths. His sharp teeth nipped at her chin, then traveled to her jawline, then lower, trailing heat down her neck. Her breathing became ragged as his fingers played over her goose-bumped flesh. Each light touch teased and tormented her with the need to have him touch her. Her body craved him. She needed him, and more than anything, Dakotah yearned for him. His lips alit on hers, coming in for a hard landing, kissing her with an edge, driving home this reality. She kissed him back, her tongue pressing the line of his lips.
Chapter 26. Braden's bear rumbled with desire. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her up in the water, against the hard rock. He marveled at the way her body fit against his. His need for her was painful, pushing him close to the threshold. It was as if they were meant to be together. He pushed her legs apart, lined up his cock, sucked a deep breath in, and in one deep thrust he was precisely where he needed to be. The bear in him roared as he grunted and pulled back, then pushed in again, driving with a force coordinated with the intensity of his emotions. His lovemaking was relentless. Too long since he'd had a woman, and never having felt these emotions, he forged into her over and over again, until he was breathless. Stopping to kiss her, he shuddered as she ran her hands over his chest. "You're so beautiful. You're mine." "All yours," she whispered, her nails scoring his scalp as she ran fingers through his hair. He thrust deeply again, her body gripping him, holding him tightly, the sensation so enveloping, so overwhelming, he felt a surge. Grabbing her hips, he pushed in deeper, and then he held himself still. He didn't move for fear of allowing it to overwhelm him, to take him down the road of no return. "What is it?" Dakotah kissed his lips, her breath warm on his flesh. "I was thinking, I want this forever." "This." She gave that head tilt. The one he'd become so familiar with, the one he loved. "You. This. All of it." She sighed. She shouldn't have done that. Between the sigh and the expression in her eyes. And then she whispered the word that took him past the point of no return. Way past it. With a growl followed by a roar, he shoved into her deeply, stretching her. He kissed her on the neck, just where it met her shoulder. One tiny kiss. She shuddered as she climaxed, and he took her mouth prisoner, drinking in her orgasm. She was his. She would always be his. His bear roared. Braden's incisors drove into her flesh, followed by the spurting of his release in her body, hot fluid pulsing deeply within her, while his mouth covered the wound he was sure stung. Dakotah moaned her pleasure and her pain, as if his very soul touched hers. Waves of passion flowed through her as her climax joined his. Braden was damn sure this woman would complete his life, and he would do anything for her. "You bit me," Dakotah said, as they lay on the towels he'd found in the containers exactly where Griz said they'd be. "I bonded you. I should have told you about it." She frowned. "What's that mean?" She worried her lip with her teeth, another thing he found completely adorable, and at the right time overwhelmingly sexy. His body agreed, a jerk in his southern regions affirming the sexiness of the woman next to him. She lay on the towel, naked, beautiful, curves in abundance, curves begging to be held. He cupped her breast with one hand, his thumb making lazy circles around her nipple, his tongue salivating, urging him to lean over and take the dusky tip into his mouth. "Bonding," he began. "That's when a shifter makes," he scratched his stubble, then leaned in, touching his lips to hers. "It means that you're mine forever. It puts a bond between us other shifters will be able to tell. You may not know this, but shifters live a long, long time. Really long." He held his hands out to show her how long, then laughed at himself, as if that would show her a number. "Being couple bonded to a shifter, Dakotah, it will change your life. You'll live a long, long time." She sighed and he paused, waiting for it to sink in. So Larson, as a shifter, he'd live a long time. And now I will too. So he won't lose his mother really early. True. He hadn't thought of that. Man, I'm dense as hell sometimes. Then again, he realized he was being hard on himself. How could he have thought that one out? He wasn't even a father. Maybe now I'll be a father to Larson, and any others. Thank you. Her whisper broke into his thoughts. Tears glistened in her eyes. Don't thank me. I couldn't live without you. And that did it. The dam broke and the tears flowed. Braden held her, pulling her close, letting her release what seemed to be ages of pent-up emotions.
Chapter 27. Braden held the door to Griz's cabin open for Dakotah. She preceded him into the room where Griz was sitting in a recliner, holding a sleeping Larson. "How'd you like that?" "Oh, Griz," Dakotah sighed. "That was incredible. We fought hard to keep this mountain free of danger, not had too many incidents, considering the dangerous world of shifters." Griz eyed them, and Dakotah remembered what Braden had said about shifters seeing the bond between mates. She wondered if that was why he was eyeballing them. "I love it. And the waterfall, too." Dakotah could barely contain her enthusiasm for the place that was so magical and so intensely personal to her. "And I know Larson will love it too, when he's old enough to enjoy it." "I hope so. I'm hoping this will be his permanent home." "Oh, we love Bear Canyon Valley." Dakotah finally felt at home. "But Griz, let's be real, we can't live with you forever. I need to make plans for Larson." She wanted to say, after her day with Braden. But she didn't. She'd let Braden tell Griz.
Epilogue. Braden knew he wasn't fooling Griz, that the other man knew he slept in Dakotah's room every evening, slipping in after Larson had fallen asleep. They hadn't been able to spend a night apart. He didn't think he'd be able to be apart from his mate ever again. Not for a single night. "Want another cup before we head out?" Griz held the coffee pot up. It was still dark outside, and they were heading to the cabin to put the finishing touches on, before turning the keys over to Tanner and Teague. Braden couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed a job like he did this one. The pure physical nature of it left him drained and sated. And hungry as hell. Funny how wielding a hammer or a drill could leave a man starving at the end of the day, even though Braden took 2 sandwiches to work with him. "I need to pack lunch, then I'm ready," he told Griz. "No need. Lunch is being delivered." He didn't raise a brow at that, because on occasion either Tanner or Teague would bring something by when they'd come to check on the progress. "Guess I'm ready. Do you have another project lined up, after we finish this one, I mean?" Braden was saving his money now, wanting to use it to buy a spot for himself, Dakotah, and Larson. "I've got a little something lined up." Griz shut the kitchen door behind him as they headed toward the truck. A little later that day, close to noon, Dakotah adjusted Larson's onesie. "Behave you. No more rain showers on your mama." She was wondering when May was going to suggest they take Larson to that order of elementals she'd mentioned. The place where they could help Larson control his elemental's impulses and maybe help her figure out how to keep Larson's elemental from killing his shifter animal. They were ready and waiting for Marty and Kelsey to pick them up and take them to lunch. Every so often, several of the shifter's mates would collect her and Larson for a visit. It was the highlight of her day, truth be told. She'd become very fond of the Bear Canyon Valley clan. The old biases she'd felt toward shifters were a thing of the past. She may not be a shifter herself, but she was as close to one as she could get without being one. "And I'm the mother of one." She looked at Larson, her heart overflowing with love for the little man. He gurgled and smiled, and then giggled when a drop hit her on the top of her hand. "Oh no. You stop that right now, young man," she said teasingly, waggling a finger at him. He let out a little laugh that sounded more like a playful growl. A knock at the door interrupted their play. "It's open." Marty and Kelsey walked in. "Where's Dominic?" Dakotah asked, wondering where the little polar bear shifter was. "He's with Sarah and Joe, playdate with Ivan." "Ready?" Moments later, when Kelsey took a left turn instead of a right, Dakotah glanced at her, then at the road, then back at Kelsey. "That's..." She pointed. "Town's that way." Marty looked back from the passenger seat. "We're doing a picnic lunch." And less than a few moments later, she'd pulled onto a hidden road that led to a driveway, and nosed into a parking place in front of a magnificent log cabin. Large with impeccable landscaping. Several trucks were in the drive. "This is the new cabin Braden and Griz were working on for Tanner and Teague, right?" Marty looked at Kelsey, then gave Dakotah a smile. "It is." Braden, Griz, Tanner, and Teague were all waiting outside at a picnic table under a large leafy tree. A lunch was spread out. From the expression on Braden's face, he was as surprised to see her as she was to be there. Dakotah surveyed the area. The view from the back porch had to be spectacular, looking over the valley. She unstrapped Larson from his carrier and stepped toward the men, walking next to Marty and Kelsey. Griz rose and took Larson from her while Braden reached for her hand. Unsure about how everyone would react, not sure if they'd be okay with their relationship, Dakotah held back. "It's no secret," Tanner said, his face beaming with a grin. "Take the man's hand. You're mates now." Dakotah laughed nervously and let Braden take her hand with one of his while he put his other arm around her shoulders. "I told you this sort of thing wasn't easy to hide, woman." He planted a kiss on her forehead. Later, full of sandwiches, potato salad, and iced tea, Dakotah leaned back against Braden's chest and let out a sigh. "There's something special about today." "As special as the lagoon?" Braden whispered in her ear. She blushed and turned her head so no one else could see her reaction. "You have a good sense of things. There's something very special about this day," Griz said, adjusting Larson, shifting him to a different position and rubbing his back. "You look pretty good with a baby in your arms." Tanner laughed. Everyone laughed and made sounds of agreement. "Hey now. Don't get carried away." Griz frowned at them. "Anyway, I was trying to say something." They all fell silent. "This mountain range has been in and out of our family for a long time. For many years, I kept vigil over the mountain range, alone, watching May and Grant struggling to get through the days with no shifter community. And now, things are much different." He pointed to Tanner and Teague. "We have shifters. We have children." He glanced down at Larson. "Several children." Dakotah wiped a tear that made its way out. She hadn't even known she was crying until the drop tickled her cheek. Griz gave her a smile. She smiled back through the tears. He continued, that brings me to this. He cleared his throat. I have waited a long time for just the right situation, the right time, the right couple. Glancing down at Larson, he added, the right family. You two, another glance at Larson, you three are it. This cabin is for you. The tunnels beneath it will be yours to care for, yours to watch over. And the mission I've had to protect, serve, and help shifters in need, that will be turned over to you. I can't think of a couple who is better suited to do this. Dakotah took a second to process, then turned back to look at Braden to gauge his reaction. Braden's jaw was clenched, his bare flashed silver in his eyes. She'd been around long enough to know he was fighting his emotions, trying to keep them from showing. Finally, glancing down at her, noting her nod of acceptance, he looked at Griz and said, I'd be honored. No, Griz said. We're honored. And happy as hell to have you here, brother. That did it. Dakotah felt his chest swell against her body. She reached for his hand and held it. We'd love to help. And she would. She'd been through enough herself with her life before Deep Hollow, then her life at Deep Hollow. She was made for this. Helping others the way she'd been helped. Larson woke and was pulling on Griz's finger. Griz tickled him. A boom of thunder erupted, a cloud appeared above head as if from nowhere. Griz picked Larson up and held him to his face. You're definitely heading to Colorado very soon, young man. His scarred face broke into a smile. Larson giggled. I hope they can help him there. He can't forever be starting storms. They's got a cousin up there, Cersei's her name. She's pretty powerful. I've got high hopes. Braden squeezed Dakotah gently. Road trip in our near future. It's looking like. She turned and pressed her lips to his. Larson burst into giggles, and lightning flashed across the sky, even on this bright sunny day. You good? Braden's voice was like warm silk to her senses and ears. Couldn't be better, she murmured. Couldn't possibly be better. She loved that so little had to be said for so much to be transmitted with this man. Her man. Her shifter. Forever after.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by L. Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.